The last farmer of two worlds woke up in a field where the earth had long since died. 7 seeds in his fist beat like hearts. He doesn't remember how he died. He remembers only the wet floor of the greenhouse and the blow of his temple against the concrete. And now, above him, there are 2 suns, and a crying girl calls him a saint. Jiwon sits up with a start. He spits out clay. 2 suns hang overhead. One is white and evil. The other is reddish and small. He blinks. The suns do not disappear. He unclenches his fist. 7 seeds. Smooth, warm, each with a cherry pit. They pulsate, rhythmically, as if alive. A stranger's straw hat sits on the back of his head. He didn't put it on. He doesn't remember anything at all after the greenhouse. Jiwon rubs the soil between his fingers. Clay mixed with silica. Poor drainage. An ingrained habit kicks in on its own. Silver grass reaches knee-high all around. He pulls a stem and crumples it in his fingers. The roots are like clovers.
A symbiosis with mushrooms.
The air is denser than usual. There's more oxygen. It makes his head spin. He stands up. The field stretches to the horizon. To the right, the roofs of the village. To the left, a dark forest. And right in front of him, a girl of about 12 is crouching, staring at him with round gray eyes, a patched dress, a huge man's hat. She is silent. Then she asks if he is the saint she has been calling for all week. Jiwon looks at his dirty hands, at the seeds. He replies that he is a farmer. He doesn't know any saints. He knows seeds. The girl lowers her head. Her shoulders shake. She is crying, quietly and ungracefully, the way children cry who have held it in for too long. Jiwon doesn't know how to comfort children. He knows how to read the land. So he crouches down again and examines the soil. The girl's name is Lena Orwald, 12 years old. She drags him through the grass to the village and tells him everything in 10 minutes. The village of Linden.
23 households. There used to be 40. People have moved away. There's no work. The nearest dungeon ran dry 6 years ago. The last adventurer passed through 2 years ago and didn't even stop for the night. Lena's father, Rudolph, was a rank C adventurer. Then a minotaur's mace flew into his knee. The bone healed crooked. Now he limps on a crutch and drowns his sorrows in ale. Her older sister Mira left for the city a year ago. She sends money, rarely. Lena keeps the expense ledger herself. She sharpens her pencil with a knife. Jiwon listens and memorizes. He's used to memorizing data. Before, it was soil temperature and acidity. Now, it's something else. 23 households, a crippled father, a sister in the city, a pencil sharpened with a knife. The village greets him with gray houses and the sour smell of cabbage. Rudolph sits on the porch, staring intently at the road. A huge man with heavy hands and a dead stare, a crutch nearby, an empty mug nearby. He eyes Jiwon from head to toe. He asks who it is. Lena says he's a farmer.
Rudolph snorts. He snaps that a farm won't grow here. The land is dead. The last turnip rotted in the garden 3 years ago. Jiwon nods. He asks to see the field. Rudolph is silent for a long time. Then he gets up with difficulty, grabs the crutch, and leads the way. Lena drags herself along behind him, carrying her father's mug. The field is behind the house. 1/2 hectare of dead earth. Not a blade of grass. A gray crust. Jiwon pulls off his hat. He crouches down. He digs with his palm. He sniffs. He pinches off a clump and puts it on his tongue. Rudolph stares at him like he's crazy. Jiwon spits it out. The soil is sour. Lots of iron. The subsoil is compacted. Something is pressing from below. Something alive. He closes his eyes. The seeds in his fist throb harder, much harder than in the field. Here. Right here. He opens his eyes and utters a single word. The underground. Rudolph freezes.
Lena, behind him, stops breathing. The silence is so thick you can hear goats chewing 3 yards away. Jiwon gets up. He walks across the field. He feels every step with the soles of his feet. Here the clay is denser. Here it's softer. Here the earth is warm. Here it's cold. He stands on the southern slope. Here. Plant a seed on the slope and the entrance will grow from the south, right onto the road. He turns to Rudolph. A small dungeon, rank F. Goblins and rats. Newbies can handle it. Exit on the south side. You'll reach the entrance on a crutch. You'll set up a stool, sit at the ticket booth, and collect a fee from everyone who comes in. This isn't heroism. It's rent. Rudolph's hands are white on the crutch. Lena isn't looking at Jiwon. She's looking at her father. Rudolph wheezes. How much does it cost? Jiwon shrugs. He doesn't know. It's his first day here. No money, no place to stay, no food. Let him sleep in the barn tonight and give him a bowl of porridge. I'll plant the seed in the morning. Rudolph stares at him for a long time. Then he turns and limps toward the house. 10 steps later, he throws over his shoulder. Porridge on the stove. The barn is open. Don't snore. At night, Jiwon lies on the straw and stares at the ceiling. Stars shine through the cracks. Unfamiliar ones. Not a single familiar constellation. He raises his hand. 7 seeds. Warm. He picks one. The smallest, the smoothest. He thinks of Rudolph. Heavy hands, dead eyes. A crutch. An empty mug. A man who once slayed minotaurs and now can't earn a penny. The seed warms in his fist. He thinks of Lena, a pencil sharpened with a knife. The ledger, 12 years, serious eyes. The seed grows hot. It almost burns his palm. Jiwon smiles. For the first time in this crazy day, he knows this feeling. That's how good seeds respond to the right soil. It doesn't matter in which world, the principle is the same. The seed must know for whom it grows. Before dawn, he goes out into the field. The first sun is still asleep. The second is already turning pink. He crouches on the southern slope, digs a hole with his finger, places the seed, covers it, and presses his palm to the ground. 10 seconds. A minute. Nothing. He walks to the well, carries a bucket, and waters it. The water disappears into the hole instantly. The earth soaks it up like a sponge. A good sign. The door creaks. Lena comes out with 2 bowls of porridge. She sits down silently beside him. They eat and watch the hole. Nothing is growing. Lena asks quietly, When? He answers, I don't know. Maybe 3 days, maybe a week. It's the first time. She nods, takes out a book and a pencil, writes,
Day 1. Seed planted. Double sun. Millet porridge. Jiwon glances at the entry, asks why she's writing about porridge. Lena answers seriously, "Everything is important." He looks at her, at the hole, at the 2 suns above the horizon.
He doesn't understand this world, doesn't understand why he's here, doesn't understand what kind of seeds he has in his pocket,
but he understands the earth. It is hungry. The seed wants to grow, and the girl beside him keeps a ledger because it's the only thing she can hold on to in a life that has long since spiraled out of control. That's enough. He knows how to work with that. Nothing happened on the second day. Jiwon took him out to the field, walked every meter, counted his steps, sniffed the earth at different spots, tasted it on his tongue. He mapped the acidity in his head. Here it's 6 and 2. Here it's 5 and 8. Here it's almost neutral. Lena followed him and wrote the numbers in the ledger. She didn't ask why. She just wrote them down. By noon, Rudolph arrived. He stood at the edge of the field. He watched. Jiwon walked up to him and asked for bone meal. Rudolph asked what kind. Jiwon said any kind. Fish bones, goat bones, anything. He needed fertilizer.
Rudolph grunted. He left. An hour later, he returned with a sack. The sack contained fish bones from a fisherman neighbor. Jiwon ground them with a stone on a flat boulder. It turned into a coarse powder. He scattered it around the hole in a circle 2 meters in diameter. He watered it. Rudolph asked what good that would do. Jiwon explained. A danga seed is like any other seed. It needs minerals. The phosphorus from the bones will speed up the growth of the root system. The danga's roots are its corridors. The stronger the roots, the more stable the dungeon. Rudolph listened. His dead eyes came to life a little. He knew the dungeons. He'd been going into them for 20 years, but he'd never thought of them as plants. On the 3rd day, the ground above the hole rose slightly, by a centimeter, maybe a centimeter and a half. Lena was the first to notice. She ran to the shed where Jiwon was repairing a rake. He came out. He looked. He touched it. The ground was warm. Warmer than yesterday. He pressed his ear to the ground and listened. Deep below, something was humming. Low and steady, like a distant motor, or like a large sleeping animal. Jiwon straightened up. He told Lena. It's growing. Lena wrote it down in the book. Day 3, the ground rose. The humming. Jiwon paused briefly. Then he added, "Write this down too. Water it in the evening. Double portion." Lena nodded and wrote it down. On the 4th day, 2 events occurred. The first, the ground had already risen 10 centimeters. A noticeable mound had formed. The grass around it had turned yellow and dried up in a perfect circle 5 meters in diameter. The dans was drawing sap from the soil. Jiwon had expected this. He had marked the boundary in advance and covered it with ash. The ash would stop the dans's roots. It wouldn't let it spread uncontrollably. Rudolph stood nearby and watched. His face was strange. Not surprise, not fear, something else. Something resembling pain. He had spent 20 years in the dungeons with a sword, and this man controlled the dungeon with a shovel and ash. The second event was simpler. A neighbor came by, an old man named Graham. He saw the mound. He turned pale. He asked if this was a wild breakthrough. Rudolph said no. He said a farmer had planted it.
Graham looked at Jiwon. He looked at the mound. He looked at Rudolph. He said they were both crazy. And he left. But an hour later he returned with his wife. His wife brought bread and salted fish. She said that if the dungeon grew, she wanted to be first in line. Not for the adventures, for the mana crystals. Her roof was leaking and she had no money to pay the roofer. On the 5th day, the mound had grown to 1/2 meter. Thin lines appeared on its surface, like cracks, but smooth, too smooth for cracks. Jiwon ran his finger along them, warm. These were the outlines of the future door. He sat down nearby and took out the remaining 6 seeds. He laid them out in his palm. Each pulsed in its own way, one faster, another slower. The third had almost stopped. He began sorting through them, sniffing them, holding them up to the ground at different points in the field. 2 seeds reacted to the northern corner, 1 to the eastern. 3 remained silent. Jiwon took note. It was early. First, the first dungeon. First, prove that it works. He put the seeds in his pocket and returned to the mound. He watered it, sprinkled some bone meal, checked the ash border. Everything was in place. The roots hadn't spread beyond the circle. A good dungeon. Obedient. On the evening of the 5th day, Lena sat on the porch, sharpening a pencil. Jiwon sat down beside her. They were silent. Then Lena asked, "Is he really a farmer?" Jiwon said yes. She asked where he was from. He paused, said from far away, very far away. Lena nodded. She didn't ask any further. Jiwon was grateful to her for that. She asked something else. Would there be goblins in the dungeon? Jiwon said most likely yes. Small ones, weak ones, rank F, wooden clubs, maybe rats, maybe mushrooms. He didn't know for sure. This was his first dungeon. Lena wrote it down in her book. Expected monsters. Goblins, rats, mushrooms, a question mark. Jiwon looked at the entry. He asked why the question mark. Lena said it was because she wasn't sure herself, and if she wrote it down without a question mark, it wouldn't be true, and the book had to be true. Jiwon nodded. He thought that in his past life she would have been awarded a scholarship for such meticulousness. Here, she has to sharpen her pencil with a knife. On the 6th day, the door emerged completely, wooden, low, with an iron ring instead of a handle. The mound had grown to 1 meter high and 3 meters wide. It looked like a burial mound. The ground around it had sunk in a ring. Dange had sucked all the moisture out of the nearest soil. Jiwon walked around it 3 times. He tapped on the walls. He listened. The humming grew louder. Something was moving inside. He pressed his palm against the door. It was warm. He pulled on the ring. Locked. The door wouldn't open. Jiwon understood. Dange wasn't ready yet. Like a fruit that had blossomed but wasn't ripe yet. A day, maybe 2. He walked away. Rudolph stood by the fence and watched. Today he'd come without his mug of ale. Jiwon noticed. He told Rudolph that the door would open tomorrow or the day after. He needed to prepare a stool, and a cash register, and a sign saying there was an admission fee. Rudolph asked how much to charge. Jiwon thought for a moment. He had no idea how much admission to an F-rank dungeon cost. He asked Rudolph. Rudolph said they charged 5 copper coins for an F rank in town. Jiwon said to charge 3. Cheaper than in town. People will come. Rudolph looked at him. For the first time in days, something alive. On the morning of the 7th day, Jiwon woke up to a sound. A quiet, deep click, as if a lock had opened deep underground. He stepped out of the shed. Lena was already standing by the hill. The door was ajar. Warmth and the smell of wet stone drifted from the crack. Lena turned to him. Her eyes were huge. Jiwon stepped closer. He peered inside. Darkness, but not hostile. A cozy darkness, like in a cellar. It smelled of earth and mushrooms. A squeak came from somewhere below. Rats, or goblins, or both. Jiwon closed the door. He turned to Lena. He told her, "Call your father. Tell him the dungeon is open." Lena ran toward the house. Jiwon stood by the door and looked out at the field. 2 suns were rising above the horizon. The morning was quiet. He pulled the remaining seeds out of his pocket and looked at them. 6 of them. 6 future dungeons. He clenched them in his fist. He said quietly to himself, "It worked." The first visitor to Linden's dungeon was a 14-year-old boy named Theo, Old Man Graham's grandson, skinny, red-haired, with a wooden sword he'd carved himself. He came in the morning. A bag of bread and a flask of water hung from his back. He placed 3 copper coins on the stool in front of Rudolph and said he wanted to go in. Rudolph looked at the wooden sword, looked at the boy, looked at Jiwon. Jiwon stood by the fence and watched. He nodded. Rudolph took the coins. Theo opened the door and stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft thud. Lena wrote it down in the book. First visitor, Theo, 14 years old, 3 copper coins, a wooden sword. Jiwon sat down next to Rudolph by the entrance. They waited. Theo came out 2 hours later, dirty, sweaty, happy. There was a scratch from a claw on his left arm, not deep. In his right hand, he clutched a small crystal, cloudy, the size of a fingernail, a mana crystal, the smallest possible, but real. Theo raised it above his head and shouted. Lena recorded it. Exit. 2 hours inside, 1 scratch, 1 mana crystal. Small. Jiwon took the crystal from Theo and examined it. Warm, glowing from the inside. Smells like earth. He returned the crystal to the boy. Asked what was inside. Theo began to speak incoherently and quickly. 3 rooms. The first one was empty, just rats. 4 of them, small ones, killed 2. The rest ran away. The second room was bigger. 2 goblins, waist high, with wooden sticks. One hit him on the arm. That's where the scratch came from. But it was a glancing blow. Theo swung his sword, and they ran behind a rock. The third room, a chest, a small wooden one, a crystal inside, and a coil of rope. He didn't take the rope. Jiwon listened and memorized. 3 rooms, rats and goblins, a chest at the end. The dungeon worked. It worked exactly as he'd expected. Small, safe, straightforward, perfect for beginners. By noon, 2 more had arrived, the blacksmith's son and the miller's daughter, 15 and 16 years old. The son had a real short sword, blunt, but made of iron.
The daughter had a hay fork. They paid 6 copper coins. They went in together. They came out an hour and a half later. 2 crystals, 0 scratches. The blacksmith's son said the goblins were funny. The miller's daughter said the rats were gross. Both wanted to go in again. Jiwon said they could, but tomorrow. Dan's needs to rest. They didn't understand. They asked why. Jiwon explained. The dungeon is like a field. After the harvest, you need rest. If you go in every hour, the will grind you down. The crystals will stop appearing. A cycle is needed. Enter in the morning, rest in the evening. A new run the next day. They didn't understand, but nodded. The farmer's authority, with 2 sons overhead, still held sway. By the evening of the first day, Rudolph's cash register held 9 copper coins. Rudolph sat on a stool and looked at them. The 9 coins lay in a neat stack on an upside-down bucket that served as a table. He hadn't had a drop of ale all day. Lena stood nearby, jotting down the day's tally. 3 customers, 9 copper coins, 0 serious injuries. Jiwon stood to the side and watched them, father and daughter. A stool and an account book. A crutch leaned against the wall. Not needed. Rudolph is sitting. Rudolph is working. Rudolph is counting money. Jiwon quietly went into the shed and sat down on the straw. He took out the seeds, 6 of them. He looked at them. 2 of them pulsed noticeably stronger than yesterday. They were sensing the first dungeon. They wanted to go into the ground. The next day, Jiwon began marking out the field. He drove stakes into 4 points: the northern corner, the eastern slope, the central hollow, the western edge by the stream. He walked between them. He checked against the seeds. 2 reacted consistently to the northern corner. 1 was drawn to the stream. Jiwon decided not to rush. First, he needed to understand how the first dange affected the soil. He took a shovel and began digging test holes all over the field, 1/2 meter deep. He sniffed at each spot. He tested them. He memorized the results. Lena followed him and wrote it down in a book. By noon, she had run out of pages. Jiwon asked if there was any more paper in the village. Lena said no. The nearest store was in Torheim, a 2-day walk. Jiwon looked at the 9 copper coins. He looked at Lena. He said, "Wait, there'll be more coins. We'll buy paper." By the end of the first week, 11 people had passed through the dungeon, all from Linden and the nearby farmsteads. All returned alive. They collected 32 copper coins worth of crystals, plus the entrance fees. A total of 53 copper coins in 7 days. Rudolph sat on a stool every day. No tardiness. No ale. He got himself a tin box for the coins. Lena decorated it with a drawing of a hill with a door. Jiwon looked at the drawing and thought that in another world she would have become a logo designer. Here she would be an accountant. Not bad either. At the start of the second week, Jiwon planted the second seed, the northern corner, further away from the first dungeon. The soil here was different, drier, more sand, less clay. He spent a long time choosing which seed to use. He went through all 6. 1 pulsed steadily and coldly, another quickly and hotly. He chose the cold one. His intuition told him that in dry, sandy soil, the cold seed would yield a cave dungeon. Stone and silence. Maybe bats instead of rats. Maybe stone golem shards instead of goblins. A different type. Different loot. Variety. Jiwon dug a hole and thought, "For whom? For whom is this dungeon?"
He remembered Graham's wife. The leaky roof. No money to pay the roofer. She doesn't need a crystal. She needs a stone. A good building stone. Cave dungeons sometimes drop stone as a byproduct. He pictured the old woman with the leaky roof.
He pictured her carrying a smooth gray stone home and placing it on the table as if it were a diamond. The seed in his hand turned icy. He smiled, planted it, watered it, covered it with soil, circled it with ash, added bone meal. Now, 2. Lena wrote it down. Day 10, second seed, north corner, cave type, expected rank F. For whom? Graham's wife and the roof. Jiwon read the entry and corrected it. Not for anyone. Why? Those are different things. Lena crossed it out and rewrote it. Why? Graham's wife and the roof. Then she looked at Jiwon and asked, And who is the first dungeon for? Jiwon looked at her, then at Rudolph, who was sitting on a stool by the entrance counting coins. He said nothing. Lena followed his gaze. She understood. She wrote it down. The first dungeon. Why? Dad. The second dungeon sprouted faster than the first, 4 days instead of 7. Jiwon surmised that the first dungeon had already saturated the soil around it, and the second seed fed on its energy through the soil layers, like neighboring trees in a forest. Their roots intertwine. They share water and minerals. He checked. He dug a trench between 2 mounds. At a depth of 20 centimeters, he discovered thin, whitish threads, like mycelium, only warm. They ran from the first dungeon to the second. Jiwon crouched over the trench and stared for a long time. Then he carefully covered it back up. Don't touch. Don't break. They connected on their own. That's good. It means that the dungeons in the same field will support each other. Lena stood nearby and looked into the trench. She asked what it was. Jiwon said, Roots. They're friends. Lena wrote it down. Roots between the dungeons. White threads. They're friends. The second dungeon opened on the 14th day after Jiwon's arrival in Linden. The hill was lower and wider than the first. The door was stone. No ring. Instead of a handle, there was a palm-shaped recess. A chill drifted from behind the door, and it smelled of wet stone. Theo went in first. He had already gone through the first dungeon 4 times and felt like a veteran. He came out an hour later. He brought 2 mana crystals and 3 pieces of smooth gray stone. The stone was excellent, solid, smooth, suitable for masonry. Graham's wife took the stone in her hands and pressed it to her chest. She said it was better than any diamond. Jiwon stood to the side and nodded to himself. He hadn't been wrong. The dungeon had turned out exactly as he had envisioned. By the end of the second week, Torheim had heard about the farm. A small town 2 days' journey away. 3 young adventurers had come from there, real ones, with guild licenses, rank F, the lowest, but official. They had cleared both dungeons in a single day. In the evening, they sat by the fire and told Jiwon about it. The dungeons are clean, straightforward, safe. The monsters are weak, but there are enough of them for training. The loot is modest but consistent. In town, they charge 5 copper coins for entry, and you can die inside. Here, it's 3 copper coins, and the worst you'll get is a bruise. They asked if they could come regularly. Jiwon said they could, but according to a schedule. He explained his rotation system. One day, the first dungeon is open.
The next day, the first one rests and the second one is open. Every 3 days, both rest. The adventurers nodded. They were used to rules. They even liked it. A schedule means predictability. Predictability means safety. On the 17th day, she arrived. April Hayes. Jiwon was standing by the fence, marking the spot for the third seed, when a figure appeared on the road. A tall woman in a worn travel cloak, 2 swords at her belt, one long, one short. Her gait was confident, calm. The gait of a person who knows where every muscle in their body is. She approached the fence. She looked down at Jiwon. She looked at the field, at the 2 hills, at the door of the first dungeon, at the stone door of the second, at Rudolph at the ticket booth, at Lena with her book. She asked briefly, "Is this a dungeon farm?" Jiwon said yes. She said she'd heard about it in Torheim and had come to check it out. She said she didn't believe in tamed dungeons. She said dungeons kill. That's their nature. And if this man says otherwise, he's either a liar or a fool. Jiwon looked at her, calmly. He said she could go in and check for herself, for free. April narrowed her eyes. Then she nodded. She took off her cloak. Underneath the cloak was light leather armor, well fitted. Darling. The swords on her belt weren't decorative. They were combat swords, sharpened to a razor's edge. She drew a short sword, opened the door to the first dungeon, went in. She came out 20 minutes later. Jiwon timed it. She'd cleared 3 rooms in 20 minutes. That's fast. Very fast. Theo took 2 hours. The adventurers from Torheim took an hour. She did it in 20 minutes. And she didn't have a single scratch on her. She came out, closed the door, looked at Jiwon. For a long time. Then she said, 4th level goblins, 2nd level rats, 3 rooms, a chest at the end, 0 traps, 0 side passages, 0 dead ends. This isn't a dungeon. It's a sandbox. Jiwon nodded, said, "That's exactly right. A sandbox for beginners, for those who've never been inside, for those who can't afford a real dungeon, for those who'd die in the very first corridor of a normal dungeon." April was silent. Her face didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. Jiwon noticed. He was used to noticing the little things, the tilt of a stem, the color of a leaf, a crack in the bark. This woman's eyes were like cracked bark, strong on the outside, ailing on the inside. He didn't ask. None of his business. For now. April didn't leave. She went into the second dungeon. Then she walked around the field. Then she sat on the fence and stayed there until evening. She watched as Theo entered the first dungeon for the 5th time. How the blacksmith's son was learning to guard the entrance with a sword. How the miller's daughter was cleaning rat skins to sell. How Rudolph was counting coins. How Lena was taking notes. In the evening she approached Jiwon. She said she wanted to stay, not as a client, as a guard. There are no guards here. Anyone can come and destroy the entrances, or wait until the newbies come out and take their loot. Jiwon hadn't thought of that. He was thinking about soil and seeds, not about people with swords. He asked how much she wanted for guard duty. April said, a roof over her head, food, and permission to use the training dungeon for her own purposes. Jiwon asked what those were. She paused. Then she said, she wants to learn not to kill. Jiwon didn't understand. she explained.
For 20 years, she'd trained to kill everything that moved in the dungeons. Her teacher had died because she hadn't killed fast enough. Since then, she'd been killing too fast, too cleanly, without hesitation. She needed a place where the monsters were weak enough that she could practice restraint, not to kill, to neutralize, to stop, to let go. Jiwon listened. Then he nodded. He said the barn was free. Porridge was on the stove. That night, Jiwon lay on the straw and thought. April slept next to him, on the other side of the wall. He heard her tossing and turning. He heard her shudder in her sleep. She was having nightmares. He knew that sound. Plants don't scream at night, but people do. He took out the seeds, 5 of them, chose one, small, warm. He closed his eyes and thought of April, a swordswoman who wants to learn not to kill. The seed twitched in his palm, just a little, weakly, not ready. Or maybe he didn't know her well enough yet. He put the seed back. Too soon. April transformed the farm in 3 days. Not because Jiwon asked her to, because she couldn't sit around doing nothing. On the first morning, she walked the perimeter of the field and counted 14 spots where the fence was broken or missing. By evening, she had repaired 7 of them. With her bare hands and some boards she found, Rudolph watched from a stool and said nothing. On the second morning, she set up 2 posts at the main entrance to the field. She stretched a rope between them. She hung up a sign she'd asked Lena to write. Linden's Dungeon Farm. Admission charged. Weapons required. Jiwon looked at the sign. He asked where she'd gotten the paint. April said she'd mixed soot with goat fat. Jiwon nodded. On the 3rd day, she drew up a duty roster. Morning, day, evening, night. 4 shifts. For now, she was the only one, but the schedule was already set. For the future. That same day, Jiwon planted the 3rd seed on the eastern slope. The soil here was richer, more organic matter. It smelled like forest litter. The seed he'd chosen pulsed fast and hot. He figured that in the rich soil, a hot seed would yield a forest dungeon, trees and moss, maybe wolves, maybe forest spirits. For whom? He closed his eyes, thought of Theo. The boy had completed both dungeons 6 times each. He had outgrown them. He needed the next step. Not rank D, too soon, but a different type. New enemies, new skills. The forest teaches caution. The cave teaches strength. The first dungeon teaches the basics. 3 dungeons, 3 lessons, 3 steps. The seed in his hand grew scorching hot. Jiwon smiled and planted it, watered it, circled it with ash, added bone meal. But this time he added something else. Leaves of that silvery grass that grew all over the field. He mashed them into a paste and mixed them into the top layer of soil. If the grass here lives in symbiosis with the mycelium, then its remains should accelerate the growth of the forest dungeon's root system. Theory. Test. Result. Just like in a greenhouse. As always. On the 21st day, Linden's village headman came to the farm. Mayor Klaus, a fat man with a red face and small eyes. He came with 2 assistants. He stood by the fence. He looked at the 2 active dungeons, at the 3rd mound already rising from the ground, at Rudolph at the cash register, at April by the post, at Lena with her book. He said he wanted his share. Jiwon approached. He asked what kind.
Klaus said 20% of the entrance fees. The land belongs to the village. Rudolph shouted from his stool that the land belongs to him. He has the documents. Klaus said the documents are old and can be reviewed. Rudolph turned pale and started to stand up. His crutch creaked. April put her hand on her sword. Quietly, without making a show of it, she just put it there. Klaus looked at her. He looked at the sword. His assistants took a step back. Jiwon raised his hand, calmly. He said to Klaus, 10%. Not from duties.
From the mana crystals mined by the residents of Linden. Not outsiders, only locals. It's fair. The village gets a share of the resources mined by its residents. Klaus thought. His small eyes darted about. He was calculating. 10% of the crystals isn't much right now, but if there are more dungeons and more people, the amount will grow. He nodded. He said he agreed. But he wants a document, an official one, with a seal. Jiwon said the document would be provided. Klaus left. April took her hand off the sword. Rudolph sat back down on the stool. His hands were shaking. Lena wrote it down. The village head, 10% of the local crystals, a document is needed. The third dungeon had grown in 3 days, faster than Jiwon expected. The silvery grass had worked. The root system had penetrated the soil in a single day. Whitish threads stretched toward both of the old dungeons. Now all 3 were connected by an underground mycelium network. The hill was no hill. It was a stump. A huge old stump of dark wood. The door was an arch of intertwined branches. The scent of pine needles and wet leaves wafted from the cracks. Jiwon peered inside. Darkness, but a different kind. Not basement-like as in the first dungeon, not stony as in the second. Alive. Green, even in the dark. He closed the door. 3 dungeons in 1 field. 3 types, 3 doors, 3 lessons. The beginning of the system. Theo entered the forest dungeon first. He came out 3 hours later, without the wooden sword. The sword had broken on the 2nd floor. Theo held a real blade in his hands, short, rusty, but made of steel. It had fallen out of a forest chest. Theo stood in the doorway and looked at the blade the way children look at a miracle. Jiwon stood nearby. He asked what was inside. Theo told him. 5 rooms instead of 3, large ones, trees growing straight out of the floor, moss on the walls, 2 wolves on the first level, real ones, fast. Had to hide behind trees and strike from around the corner. 2nd level, forest goblins, bigger than usual, 4 of them. 1 had a bow. An arrow hit a tree right next to his head. Theo showed a splinter in his hair. 3rd level, a large clearing, a chest in the center. But an ogre was standing next to the chest, a small ogre, human-sized. Theo circled around him along the edge of the clearing. The ogre didn't notice. Theo grabbed the chest and ran toward the exit. The ogre ran after him, but Theo was faster. Jiwon listened. 5 rooms, wolves, archer goblins, a small ogre. This isn't rank F. This is E rank. The dungeon had grown a level stronger than he'd planned. The silvery grass and the connection through the mycelium had strengthened the seed. He'd have to keep that in mind for the future. Lena wrote everything down, including the splinter in Theo's hair. That evening, Jiwon sat at the edge of the field and looked at the 3 hills. 3 dungeons,
3 doors, 3 stories.
The first for Rudolph, the second for Graham's wife, the third for Theo.
Each grew from a specific person, each for a specific need. He took out the remaining seeds, 4 of them, 4 future dungeons. He didn't know yet for whom, but he knew he would find out. People come, people bring their problems, and he plants. April walked over and sat down next to him, silently. They sat and watched the sunset. 2 suns set one after the other, the first one white, the red one behind it. The sky turned purple, then black. The stars spilled out in unfamiliar patterns. April asked, "He always knows who he's growing for." Jiwon said yes. It doesn't work without that. The seed must know who it's for, otherwise it'll grow into a dud. April was silent. Then she asked, "Would he grow something for her?" Jiwon looked at her. In the darkness, he couldn't see her face, just a silhouette. The swords at her belt, her straight back. He said, "When I figure out what you need." She didn't answer.
She stood up and went into the barn.
Jiwon remained seated. The seeds in his pocket were silent. Not a single one was pulsing. It was still too early. On the 24th day, a man arrived from Torheim. Not an adventurer, a bureaucrat. A short man in a gray cloak, with papers. He introduced himself as the assistant to the regional representative of the licensing chamber. He said rumors had reached the chamber about unregistered dungeons in the village of Linden. He asked if the owner had a license. Jiwon said no. The official made a note. He asked if there was a landowner's title. Jiwon said he was working on Rudolf Orwald's land. The official made a note. He asked if there was a certificate from the Cartographers Guild for the dungeon's classification. Jiwon said no. The official made a note. He closed the folder. He said that without a license, title, and certificate, access to the dungeon must be immediately suspended.
The fine for each day of operation without the required documents is 20 silver coins. The farm didn't have that much money. The official said he would return in 10 days with an inspector. If the entrances weren't sealed by then, the farm would be forcibly shut down. He turned and left. Rudolph stood by the stool and watched him go. Lena clutched the book to her chest. April was silent. Jiwon stood in the field between 3 hills. 10 days. They gave him 10 days to legalize what he had been building for 24 days. He looked at the seeds in his hand. 4 of them. They pulsed anxiously, quickly, like little frightened hearts. 10 days. Jiwon stood in the field and counted. A license to manage the underground, a landowner's title, a certificate from the Cartographers Guild, 3 documents, each issued in a different place. The license at the regional office of the licensing chamber, the title at the Torheim Land Registry, the certificate at the nearest branch of the Cartographers Guild. It was a 2-day walk to Torheim, 4 days round trip. It's unclear how long the paperwork will take. Bureaucracy is the same in any world. Jiwon knew this from his past life. He waited 7 months for a greenhouse permit in Jeju. Here, he has 10 days. He turned to Rudolph. He asked if there was anyone in Torheim whom Rudolph knew personally, someone with influence. Rudolph thought for a moment. He said there was. A former squad mate, Henrik Moss. Now he was a low-level clerk at the land office.
They hadn't spoken in 2 years, ever since Rudolph broke his leg and stopped leaving the house. Jiwon asked if Rudolph would write him a letter. Rudolph was silent. Then he nodded. It was hard, as if it cost him more than 20 years in the dungeons. The next morning, Jiwon set out on the road. In his pocket lay Rudolph's letter, 112 copper coins, the farm's entire earnings for 3 weeks, and 4 seeds.
April walked beside him. Jiwon told her he hadn't asked her to come. She said that the road to Torheim passed through Wolf's Hollow and that 3 caravans had been robbed there in the past year. Jiwon looked at his hands, the hands of an agronomist, not a fighter. He didn't argue. Lena stayed at the farm. She stood by the fence and watched them leave. Jiwon turned around once. Lena raised the book above her head. The gesture spoke volumes. She would write everything down while he was gone. The journey to Torheim took a day and a half. April walked faster than Jiwon had expected. She knew the shortcuts. They crossed Wolf's Ravine at night. April hadn't slept. Jiwon had slept for 2 hours during a rest stop while she sat by a tree with her sword on her lap. He woke up and saw that she was staring into the darkness. He asked quietly if she could see anything. She said, 2 wolves to the north, 3 foxes to the west, a man in a tree 100 paces away. Jiwon froze. He asked what kind of man. April said, a watchman, most likely a scout for the bandits. He's been watching them since evening.
Jiwon asked what to do. April said, nothing. He's alone. She's worth 10 men. The man in the tree knows this. He won't attack. Jiwon looked at her. In the moonlight, she looked like a statue, cold and utterly calm. He thought she wasn't bragging. She was stating a fact, just as he states the acidity of the soil. A fact, not an emotion. They reached Torheim by noon the next day. Torheim turned out to be a small town of 1,500 people, stone walls, a market square, 3 taverns, the Cartographers' Guild branch, the land registry, the licensing chamber's office, all in 1 block. Convenient. Jiwon started with the land registry. He found Henrik Moss, a thin man with a tired face sitting at a desk piled high with papers. He read Rudolph's letter. His expression changed. First surprise, then something gentle, then weariness again. He asked Jiwon,
does Rudolph really get up every day and sit at the cash register? Jiwon said yes, every day, never late. Henrik placed the letter on the table. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. He said that the title of small landowner could be formalized. Rudolph's land is registered in the cadastre. If Rudolph transfers the right of use to Jiwon, a power of attorney and a fee are required. The fee is 30 copper coins. Jiwon paid. Henrik processed the paperwork in 2 hours. He stamped it. He said quietly, tell Rudolph I'm glad. Jiwon nodded. The second document. The Cartographers' Guild. A small office, 2 rooms. A middle-aged woman in a uniform vest sat at the desk. A 3rd-class cartographer. Jiwon explained the situation. 3 dungeons on private land. Need classification and a certificate. The woman raised an eyebrow. 3 dungeons on a single plot? That's unusual. Usually 1 dungeon per square kilometer. Jiwon said he'd planted them. The woman looked at him, then at April, then back at him. She asked, planted.
Jiwon said yes. She paused. She said that for classification, a cartographer would need to visit the site. The cost of the visit was 20 silver coins. Jiwon didn't have 20 silver coins. He had 82 copper coins left after the title fee. 10 copper coins equal 1 silver coin. 82 copper coins. 12 short. Jiwon stood at the counter in thought. April stood beside him and said nothing. Then she unfastened the clasp on her wrist. She took off the bracelet. Heavy, silver, engraved. She placed it on the counter. She said that would be enough. The female cartographer took the bracelet, weighed it in her palm, nodded, made a note. Departure in 3 days. Jiwon turned to April. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the wall. He noticed that a white mark remained on her wrist where the bracelet had been. She had been wearing it for a long time. A very long time. He didn't ask. Not now. The third document. The licensing chamber.
A larger office. 3 officials. A line of 5 people. Jiwon waited an hour. When he approached the window, the official asked for the license type. Jiwon said, "Cultivated Dungeons Administration." The official looked up. He asked, "What kind?" Jiwon repeated, "Cultivated, grown, planted." The official leafed through the catalog. For a long time. Then he said that such a category didn't exist. There's a license for managing natural dungeons. There is a license for developing a wild breakthrough. There is a license for sealing. There are no cultivated dungeons in the catalog. Because they don't exist. Jiwon stood by the window and looked at the official. The official looked at him. A dead end. The system didn't account for what Jiwon was doing. Nowhere to fit it. Nowhere to file it. No form, no category, no precedent. The official said he couldn't help. "Next." Jiwon walked away. He sat down on a bench in the hallway. April sat down next to him. She was silent. Jiwon thought. In his past life, he had faced the same thing. When he applied for a vertical farm, they told him there was no category for vertical farms in the classification system. There's a greenhouse, there's open ground, no vertical farm. He spent 3 months getting it added. Here, he doesn't have 3 months. He has 5 days. He stood up. He walked over to the window again. The official looked up, irritated. Jiwon said, "Issue a license to operate a natural underground facility. 3 of them." "On Rudolf Orwald's plot in Linden," the official asked. "They're natural," Jiwon said. "They grow out of the ground, like all dungeons." The official thought. Technically, that wasn't a lie. Dungeons did indeed grow out of the ground. The fact that a human had planted them wasn't discussed in the catalog. Because the catalog didn't know that was possible, the official shrugged. He issued 3 licenses. The fee was 15 copper coins each, 45 copper coins. Jiwon had 37 copper coins left. He was 8 short.
He looked at April. She was already reaching for her belt. Jiwon shook his head. Enough. He turned to the official. He asked if he could pay part of it with mana crystals. The official said he could. Crystals were accepted at a rate of 1 small crystal equal to 5 copper coins. Jiwon took 2 crystals out of his pocket that Theo had given him for the journey. He placed them on the counter. He paid. He received 3 sheets with seals, 3 licenses to manage the dungeons in the outside Linden. He folded them neatly, tucked them into his coat. He stepped out onto the street. The suns were shining, both of them. Jiwon looked up at the sky, then at April. He said, 2 out of 3. Now we just have to wait for the cartographer. April nodded. Then she asked, "Why did he say the dungeons were natural?" Jiwon replied, "Because they are natural. He just helped." On the way back, Jiwon walked in silence. April walked beside him. It was quiet in Wolf's Hollow. There was no watcher in the tree. He must have left. Or maybe April had scared him away just by being there. During a rest by the stream, Jiwon took out the seeds, 4 of them. He looked at them in the moonlight. Then he looked at the white stripe on April's wrist. She was asleep. For the first time, he saw her sleeping without nightmares. Or maybe he just didn't hear them. He held 1 seed in his hand. He closed his eyes. He thought of her. The woman who sold her bracelet without a second thought. The woman who wants to learn not to kill. The woman who can't sleep at night because her teacher died and she didn't make it in time. The seed in his hand grew warm. Truly warm. Not hot as it was for Theo. Not icy as it was for Graham's wife. Warm. Like a hand being held. Jiwon opened his eyes. He looked at the seed. This was it. For her. He put it in a separate pocket. 3 remained. They returned to the farm by evening on the second day. Lena was standing by the fence, waiting. She saw them from a distance and ran to meet them. The book bounced under her arm. She stopped in front of Jiwon and asked for 1 word. It worked. Jiwon took the papers from his bosom, unfolded them. The title, 3 licenses. Lena took them in her hands. She read them slowly. She moved her lips. Then she pressed them to her chest. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She no longer cried in front of Jiwon. She wrote in the book. Title obtained. Licenses obtained. The cartographer will arrive in 3 days. 2 documents out of 3 remain. Jiwon corrected it. 1 out of 3 left. We have the title and the licenses. We just need the cartographer's certificate. Lena crossed it out and corrected it. Rudolph was waiting on a stool. Jiwon walked over and handed him the letter. Not a piece of paper. A note. Henrik had written 4 words on the back of the receipt. Rudolph read it. His face twitched.
He folded the note and put it in his breast pocket. He didn't say what was written there. Jiwon didn't ask. Some things between old partners don't need witnesses. Jiwon spent the 3 days before the cartographer's arrival preparing. The 3rd dungeon was already operational. The forest, rank E. Theo led groups of 3 people there, twice a day, in the morning and after lunch. Between runs, the Dange rested. Jiwon walked between the 3 hills and checked the soil. The mycelium between the dangers had grown thicker. The threads were no longer whitish but silvery, like that grass. The dungeons fed off each other. It was both good and alarming at the same time. Good because stability was growing. Alarming because he didn't know the limits. What if the mycelium spread beyond the ash circle? What if the dungeon started growing uncontrollably? He doubled the ash line, added a second circle 1/2 meter wider than the first. Between the circles, he spread a mixture of ash and crushed coal. A barrier, like in a greenhouse. A double perimeter. A safety net. On the second day, he planted the 4th seed, for April. He chose the spot carefully, the western edge of the field, by the stream. The soil was damp.
soft, sand and silt. The seed he had set aside for her pulsed evenly and warmly. He closed his eyes. He imagined. Not monsters, not loot, not rooms. He imagined silence. A place where swords aren't needed, where there's no need to kill, where you can just stand and breathe and listen to the water. The seed in his hand grew hot. He planted it, watered it from the stream, circled it with ash, didn't add bone meal, didn't add silver grass. This dungeon must grow slowly, gently, without pressure, just as she herself wanted to learn, slowly. April stood 20 paces away and watched. She didn't approach, didn't ask, but she saw. Jiwon knew she saw. On the third day, the cartographer arrived. Not a woman from the office, a man. Young, about 25, slender hands, glasses, a clipboard with paper and a set of measuring tools in a leather case. He introduced himself as Oliver Stan, a fifth-class cartographer, the lowest rank. Jiwon thought they'd sent the youngest one to classify the 3 F and E rank dungeons. Logical, a minor job for a minor cartographer. Oliver surveyed the field. He examined the 3 hills. He opened the first dungeon, went inside, came out an hour later, jotted something down on his tablet, went into the second one, came out 40 minutes later, jotted something down, went into the third one, came out 2 hours later, scratched up, but unharmed. He made a note. Then he sat down on the fence and stared at the field for a long time. Then he turned to Jiwon. He said, 3 dungeons within a 50-meter radius, connected by an underground mycelium network, stable, with a predictable structure, 2 rank F, 1 rank E. He asked, how? Jiwon said, planted. Oliver took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, asked again. Planted. Jiwon repeated. Planted, like seeds, in the ground, with watering and feeding. Oliver looked at him, then at the mounds, then at the mycelium that Jiwon had shown him in the test trench. Then he took out a blank sheet of paper and began to draw a diagram of the field. Quickly and precisely, every mound, every contour, every ash line, distances, angles, soil types. He drew for 40 minutes without looking up. When he finished, he had 3 sheets of neat notes and a detailed map of the farm. He looked at Jiwon. He said quietly, "This is impossible." Jiwon said, "But it exists." Oliver nodded. He wrote out 3 certificates. He stamped them, dungeon class, ranks, coordinates, all official. Then he asked if he could come back again, in a month, with instruments for deep-level measurements. He wants to study the mycelium. Jiwon said it was okay. Oliver packed his case, adjusted his glasses. He walked down the road toward Torheim. After 10 steps, he turned around. He said, "I'll write about this in the report for headquarters. They won't believe it. But I'll write it." Jiwon nodded. That evening, Jiwon laid out all the documents on an upside-down bucket next to Rudolph's stool. The landowner's title, 3 chamber licenses, 3 cartographers' guild certificates, 7 documents, 7 seals. Linden Farm officially existed. Rudolph looked at the papers. Lena looked at the papers. April stood by the post and didn't look. She was looking at the stream, at the western edge of the field. There, a small mound was rising from the ground. The fourth dungeon was beginning to grow. Jiwon caught her gaze. She turned away, quickly. He didn't say anything. The next day, the official from the licensing chamber returned, the same one, short, in a gray raincoat. A taller man walked with him, in a dark travel suit, with a larger folder. The inspector.
The official approached the fence and said the deadline had passed. Jiwon went out to them. He handed over the papers, all 7 of them. The official took them. He read. His face changed. He passed them to the inspector. The inspector read them longer. Then he looked up at Jiwon, then at the 3 hills, then at the 4th mound. He asked, 4 dungeons. The certificate says 3. Jiwon said the 4th one was still growing. When it matures, he'll call in a cartographer for classification. The inspector was silent. Then he said, "The documents are in order. No fines. The farm can operate. But he recommends a visit from a senior inspector from the provincial capital. It's not a threat, it's a procedure for facilities with more than 2 dungeons on a single plot." Jiwon nodded. The inspector and the official left. Rudolph exhaled, loudly, as if he'd been holding his breath the whole time. Lena made a note. Inspection passed, documents accepted, senior inspector from the capital expected. The 4th dungeon took 12 days to grow, slower than all the others. Jiwon didn't rush it. Every morning he came to the stream and sat down next to the mound. He checked the temperature of the earth with his palm. He listened to the hum. Quiet, low, not alarming, a calm hum, as if something big were breathing slowly underground. He didn't add fertilizer. He didn't water more than usual. He just watched. Every morning, April walked past this mound on her way to patrol the perimeter. She slowed her pace. For a second, no more. But Jiwon noticed. On the 35th day after his arrival in Linden, the 4th dungeon opened. The mound was not high, round, covered in moss. The door was wooden, lightweight, no lock, no handle, just a door you could push open with a finger. A scent of water and warm stone wafted from behind it. Not cold, not damp, warm. Jiwon opened the door and peered inside. There was light inside. Not torchlight, not magical, just soft, diffused light. Like in a greenhouse on a cloudy day. He closed the door, turned around. April was standing 10 paces away. She was looking at the door. Jiwon said, "This one's for you." She didn't move. He said, "Go without your swords." She looked at him for a long time. Then she unfastened her belt. 2 swords fell onto the grass. She walked to the door, opened it, stepped inside. The door closed. She came out 4 hours later. Jiwon had been waiting all that time. He, crouching by the stream, cleaning the ash lines around the other dungeons. When the door opened, he looked up. April stood in the doorway. She didn't have a scratch on her, not a speck of dust. She looked as if she'd spent 4 hours in a bathhouse. Her eyes were red. She'd been crying. Jiwon didn't ask what was inside. He stood up. He walked over.
She said quietly, "There are no monsters there." He nodded. She said, "There are 3 rooms. The first is a clearing by a lake. The water is clear, warm, quiet, not a sound.
The second is a forest, but not a wild one, well maintained, paths, stone benches, birds singing. The third is a cave with a hot spring. The steam smells of herbs." She said she sat by the lake for an hour. Then she walked through the forest. Then she lay in the hot water and looked at the ceiling where little stones glowed, like stars. Jiwon nodded. She said, "This isn't a dungeon." Jiwon said, "It is a dungeon. Rank F. 0 monsters, 0 traps, 0 loot. Useless by any catalog standards. 0 profit, 0 crystals." She asked, "Why?" Jiwon said, "Because not all wounds come from monsters. Some come from not being able to stop. This dungeon is a place where you can stop." April was silent. Then she picked up the swords from the grass, strapped them to her belt, said one word. "Thank you." She went on patrol. Jiwon stood by the door and watched her go. Then he looked at the dungeon, then at the stream, then at the sky. 2 suns were setting. Lena stood by the fence with a book. She wrote down, "4th dungeon, rank F. Type, rest. Monsters, 0. Loot, 0. For whom? April." By the 45th day, 73 adventurers had passed through Linden Farm. Theo had gone from a boy with a wooden sword to a skinny, wiry teenager with a real short blade and an F-rank license he'd received from the guild's traveling registrar for 5 copper coins. He led groups of newbies through all 3 combat dungeons. He knew every room, every goblin, every rat, every wolf. He had become an instructor. Jiwon hadn't appointed him. Theo had done it himself. The first visitor had become the first teacher. Jiwon watched this and thought of So-young, his former assistant from Cheju, who had also started as an intern and, a year later, knew the greenhouse better than the boss. Some things are the same in any world. The farm's income for the first month was 412 copper coins, 41 silver, and 2 copper. Lena kept the books down to the last coin. Expenses: Bone meal, ash, firewood, food, new rope for the fence, repairing the barn roof. Total net profit: 28 silver coins. For the village of Linden, that was a huge sum of money. Rudolph used the money to order himself a new crutch. Not a wooden one, an iron one, with a soft leather handle. Lena used the money to buy 3 new notebooks and a pack of pencils in Torheim, real ones, not stubs. She laid them out on the table and looked at them for a long time. Then she carefully put them away in a box. Jiwon watched from behind the door and turned away so she wouldn't see his face. On the 48th day, a wagon appeared on the road. Small, covered, 2 mules. The wagon stopped by the fence. A girl got out, short, barefoot, in a simple linen dress, light hair, big eyes. A canvas bag of dried herbs slung over her shoulder. She looked around. She looked at the dongi, at the field, at the silvery grass all around. Then she bent down, plucked a blade of grass, crushed it between her fingers, sniffed it. She tasted it on her tongue. Jiwon stood by the fence and watched.
She was doing exactly what he had done on the first day. She realized he was watching. She raised her head. She introduced herself. So-young Park, a former priestess of the Southern Temple. She said she had heard of a man who planted dungeons like vegetables. She had been traveling for 4 days. She said she'd been expelled from the temple for heresy because she claimed that dungeons grow from the earth like trees, not that they fall from the sky as the gods' punishment. Everyone around her thought she was crazy. She said she wanted to see it with her own eyes. Jiwon was silent. Then he spoke. She tastes the earth. So-yeon nodded. She said that the earth tells more than people do. Jiwon looked at her. She stood barefoot on the road, and there was something familiar in her eyes. Not despair, not hope, stubbornness.
The quiet, calm stubbornness of a person who knows they're right but whom no one believes. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror 5 years ago when his vertical farming startup was considered a whim. He said, "Porridge on the stove. The barn's taken. But there's an attic." So-yeon smiled, widely, openly, the way people smile when they haven't been told come in a long time. So-yeon settled into the farm in 2 days. On the first morning, she walked around all 4 dangs. She didn't go inside. She walked around them. She touched the walls of the hills with her palms. She pressed her ear to the ground. She sniffed the air at every door. Jiwon followed her and watched. She stopped between the second and third dungeons, crouched down, raked the earth with her hands, found silvery threads of mycelium, looked up at Jiwon, said that the sacred texts of the Southern Temple described the root network, an ancient system of communication between the dungeons that supposedly existed in the first centuries after the Abyss Break. The temple considered it a metaphor. She considered it a literal description. That's why she was expelled. Jiwon crouched down beside her. He showed her how the threads ran from dungeon to dungeon. He pointed out the gray lines. He pointed out the double outline. He explained why. So-yeon listened. Her eyes grew wider and wider. Then she said, "He is doing what the first gardener did." Jiwon asked who that was. So-yeon said that the sacred texts mention a being who planted the first dungeons 1,500 years ago. The temple calls him the Abyss. But in the oldest scrolls she had read in secret in the forbidden archives, it is called something else. The first gardener. The one who sowed Gerholm. Jiwon was silent. The seeds in his pocket pulsed. 3 of them. Quietly, but insistently. He asked, "What happened to the first gardener?" So-yeon said that no one knows. He disappeared, left only the dungeons and the seeds, which have been sprouting on their own ever since, like weeds in an abandoned garden. Jiwon looked at his hands, at the dirt under his fingernails, at the calluses from shovel. Weeds in an abandoned garden. Those words caught on something in his memory. He didn't think about it, not yet. On the second day, So-yeon began to cook, not because she was asked to, because she saw what the farm lived on. Porridge, bread, salted fish, goat's milk, the ale that Rudolph no longer drank but which stood in the corner. So-yeon found 4 kinds of edible herbs in the field. She found wild onions by the stream. She found mushrooms in the forest beyond the field. By evening, she had made a soup that made Jiwon's eyes close on their own. He hadn't eaten anything like it since Korea. Rudolph ate 2 bowls. Lena ate 3. April ate 1. But slowly. Very slowly.
as if she wanted to make it last.
Theo followed the smell from the road and stayed until dark. So-yeon fed everyone and smiled. She smiled so often that Jiwon first thought it was a mask, then he realized it wasn't. She really was happy. For the first time in a long time. She was cooking for people who ate and didn't ask if she believed correctly. On the 50th day, Jiwon decided to conduct an experiment. Cross-pollination. 2 seeds out of the 3 remaining. He thought about it for a long time. If danji were plants, their seeds could be pollinated, planted side by side, in a single hole, or in 2 holes a palm's width apart, allowing the roots to intertwine during the germination stage. He didn't know what would happen. No one had ever tried it. He chose 2 seeds. One pulsed evenly and felt moist, a water type. The other was dry and heavy, a stone type, a ruin type. Water and stone. If he's right, it'll turn out to be a swamp dungeon, or an underwater temple, or something not in the guild's catalog. A planting spot. The central hollow of the field. The lowest point. Water collects there after rain. The soil is muddy, perfect for the water component. Stone in the subsoil will provide the stone element. He dug 2 holes, a palm's depth, 10 centimeters apart, placed a seed in each, covered them, mixed the soil between the holes so the roots would find each other right away, watered them, circled them with ash, generously. This dange could grow larger than usual. He added bone meal. He added silver grass. He pressed his palms against the ground. He closed his eyes. For whom? He wondered. For no one in particular. Not yet. He thought of everyone who would come after, of those he hadn't met yet. The seeds underground stirred, weakly, hesitantly. Without a specific person, they grew worse. He knew that, but he wanted to check. So-yeon stood nearby and watched. She asked why there were 2 seeds in one place. Jiwon explained. Crossbreeding. A new type. So-yeon nodded. Then she said that the texts of the first gardener describe something similar. Intertwining. 2 roots become one. A tree is born that did not exist before. Jiwon looked at her. He asked. The texts describe the result. So-yeon shook her head. Only the principal, only the gardener saw the result. Jiwon nodded. So we'll see it together. On the 53rd day, what Jiwon feared happened. A wild breach. Not on his field, nearby, 200 meters to the east, on no man's land between Linden and the forest. In the morning, Lena ran to the shed. Her face was pale. She said the ground was shaking beyond the stream. Jiwon ran, April ran, So-yeon followed them. By the stream, the ground had swollen into a bubble, 3 meters in diameter. The surface was cracking. Black smoke was rising from the cracks. It smelled of rotten eggs and something sour. Jiwon stopped 10 paces away. This isn't his dungeon. It's wild, uncontrollable. It grew on its own, without a seed, without planting, without ash lines. April drew her sword. She stood between the breach and Jiwon. So-yeon crouched down and touched the ground. She said the soil around it was dead. The acidity is off the charts. Something is sucking everything out of the soil. Jiwon looked at the bubble. He thought. Wild outbreaks appear randomly, everyone knows that. But this one appeared right next to his farm.
right now, when 4 danja in the field are saturating the soil with energy, when the mycelium has spread 30 meters, when he planted 2 seeds in a single hole. Coincidence or not? He recalled the words from his briefing document. Uncontrolled dungeons belonging to others to grow suspiciously close to his field, like weeds reaching for fertilized soil. There it is. The first weed. Jiwon acted quickly. He couldn't go inside. He would die at the first monster's hands, but he could act from the outside. He shouted to Lena to bring the ashes, all of them, and the coal. So-yeon ran after her to help.
Jiwon circled the bubble. He was looking for roots.
He found them. Thin black threads ran from the bubble to his field, to the mycelium. A parasite. The wild dungeon had latched onto its mycelium and was drawing energy from it, like aphids on a rose bush. April stood with her sword and waited. Jiwon told her, "Don't touch the bubble. Cut the roots, the black threads, all the ones you find." April nodded. She crouched down. She plunged her sword into the ground. She cut. Black liquid spurted from the severed thread. It smelled like acid. April didn't flinch. She kept cutting, one after another. Lena and So-yeon brought the ash, 2 buckets. Jiwon poured it into a ring around the bubble, tightly, no gaps. Coal on top, more ash on top, a triple barrier. The bubble trembled. Thicker smoke seeped out of the cracks. The stench became unbearable. So-yeon pinched her nose. Lena stood still. She held the empty bucket like a shield. Jiwon stood by the ring and watched. The bubble was deflating.
Slowly. Without nourishment from the mycelium, it was dying. A wild dange without roots is a sham, a parasite without a host. By evening, the bubble had deflated. A black circle of dead earth remained, 3 meters of rotten, scorched soil. Jiwon stood at the edge and watched. So-yeon approached. She said quietly, "There will be more." Jiwon nodded. He knew. This was the first weed, not the last. The more fertile his field, the more weeds would be drawn to it. In the evening, he sat on the porch of Rudolph's house. Everyone was inside. So-yeon was cooking. Lena was writing down the day's events. Rudolph was cleaning a tin coin box. April was sharpening a sword. Everyone was busy. Everyone was home. Jiwon sat outside and looked at the field. 4 dangs, 2 seeds in the hole for the 5th. 1 seed remained in his pocket. The last one. He held it in his hand. It pulsed calmly, steadily. He didn't know who it was for, not yet, but someone would come. Someone always comes. The cross dang grew strangely. Not a hill, not a stump, not a burial mound. A wall rose from the ground, smooth, stone, covered in moss and damp with dew that wasn't there. Water seeped from the stone from within. Jiwon came every morning and touched the wall with his palm. The stone was warm, damp, alive. On the 5th day, the wall had grown to 2 meters. A second one appeared behind it, a passage between them, narrow. The ceiling closed in on its own from intertwined stone ribs. Jiwon peered into the passage. Darkness, but not black, greenish,
like light through a thick layer of water. It smelled of algae and old stone. So-yeon stood nearby. She said it looked like a temple. Jiwon said he didn't know. This was his first crossbreeding. He didn't control the form. The two seeds decided for themselves what the architecture would be. So-yeon crouched down and touched the wall. Her fingers trembled. She said quietly, "It's a temple. A real one."
An underground temple flooded with water and overgrown with stone. Something you won't find in any catalog. A new type. Jiwon looked at her. She was smiling, not widely as usual, quietly, like a person who had spent their whole life saying the earth was round and finally saw the horizon from above. On the 60th day, the temple gate opened. The entrance was a stone arch entwined with green vines. A pattern emerged above the arch, not carved, grown, like patterns on tree bark, circles and lines. So-yeon looked at the patterns and wept. She said they were the writings of the first gardener. She had seen similar ones in the forbidden archives of the Southern Temple, but these weren't copies. These were new. They had grown on their own. Jiwon didn't understand what they meant, but he sensed it. The seeds in his pocket. The last seed. It pulsed in time with the patterns on the wall. A coincidence or a resonance? Theo was the first to enter the temple dungeon. He had already run through all 3 combat dungeons a dozen times. His rank had risen to E. He wanted to test himself. 2 adventurers from Torheim went with him, both rank E, armed, ready. They went in that morning. They came out 6 hours later. Theo was soaked from head to toe. One adventurer was limping, the was carrying a full bag. Theo sat down on the grass and began to tell his story. 7 levels. The first 3 are knee-deep in water, slime-covered walls, slippery. Monsters, water lizards, fast. They bite, but they aren't poisonous. 4th level. A hall with columns, high ceiling, echoes, 2 stone golems. Slow, heavy. One hit the adventurer with a shield. That's why he's limping. 5th level. A bridge over an underground lake. Something big under the bridge. It didn't attack, but they saw a shadow. 6th level. A maze of wet walls. Stone rats, lots of them. Small, strong. It took half an hour to get through. 7th level. A temple hall. Round, high. In the center, an altar made of green stone. 3 items on the altar. A ring, a scroll, a crystal. The crystal was fist-sized, green, glowing from within. A mana crystal of that size is worth at least 5 silver coins. The ring is bronze with a green stone. The scroll is indecipherable. The text were unfamiliar. Theo laid out the loot on the grass. Everyone gathered around. Rudolph slid off the stool and stared at the crystal. Lena was taking notes. April was examining the ring. So-yeon took the scroll. She unrolled it. Her hands trembled. She said these weren't letters. It was a seed catalog, a list of dungeon types that could be grown from various combinations of seeds, incomplete, damaged, but genuine. Jiwon took the scroll. He looked at the symbols. He didn't understand a single one, but the patterns on the scroll matched the patterns above the entrance arch and the pulsation of the last seed in his pocket. News of the temple dungeon reached Torheim that same day. Adventurers had spread the word. 3 days later, 6 people arrived at the farm. A week later, there were 12. A line. For the first time,
There was a line at the Linden farm. Rudolph counted the coins. His fingers couldn't keep up. Lena started a second notebook. The first one was full. The temple dungeon brought in more than the other 3 combat dungeons combined. The green crystals were 5 times more expensive than the usual ones. The rings and amulets that dropped from the chests on the 7th level were unique. None of them were listed in any catalog. Oliver Stan arrived 5 days later, uninvited. He heard about it and rushed over. He spent 8 hours inside the temple dungeon. He came out with a dozen pages of notes. He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes, said to Jiwon, "This dungeon is rank C at least, possibly B. He doesn't know. There's no such type in the guild's catalog. A swamp temple, a hybrid, a new category. The catalog will have to be rewritten."
Jiwon nodded. He asked, "Is that a problem?" Oliver said, "Not for you. For the guild, yes."
So-Yun sat with the scroll every evening. She deciphered the symbols. She compared them to what she remembered from the Forbidden Archive. Slowly, 1 symbol per hour. She didn't complain. She glowed. Jiwon saw it. Every evening when he passed by her corner in the attic, he saw the flickering candle and her bowed head. She was muttering, writing, crossing out, writing again. One evening he stopped by the stairs. He asked, had she found anything? So-Yun looked up. Her eyes were burning. She said the catalog described 32 types of dungeons. She had deciphered only 7 so far. Forest, cave, water, fire, ruins, swamp, and one without a name. Just a symbol, a circle with a dot in the center. Next to it was a note that So-Yun translated as first, or initial, or original. Jiwon stood by the stairs and listened. A circle with a dot in the center. A seed. The first seed.
The very one, planted 1,500 years ago.
He thanked So-Yun and left. He lay down on the straw. He took out the last seed. He looked at it by starlight. It pulsed, steadily, insistently, as if it were speaking. It's time. But Jiwon didn't know where to plant it, or for whom. And he was afraid. For the first time since he'd been here, he was afraid. Because whoever planted the first seed 1,500 years ago had left a catalog. And catalogs are left by those who plan to return. On the 65th day, a rider appeared on the road, alone, on a fine horse, in a cloak bearing a coat of arms that Jiwon didn't recognize, but Rudolph recognized at once. He stood up from the stool, turned pale. He said one word. Cauldron. The horseman dismounted by the fence. He took off his gloves. He looked at the farm, at the 5 dungeons, at the line at the temple entrance, at Rudolph, at April with her sword. He took a scroll out of his bag, unrolled it, read it aloud.
The Crimson Cauldron Guild, represented by Master Garrett Mole, lodges an official protest against the illegal activities of the Linden farm. Grounds. The monopoly on the dungeons of the northern region belongs to the Crimson Cauldron under a 20-year-old charter. Any new dungeons within the region must be registered through the Cauldron and are subject to a tax of 30% of the revenue. Deadline, 30 days. In case of refusal, the Cauldron reserves the right to take coercive measures. The horseman rolled up the scroll.
He placed it in Jiwon's hand. He mounted his horse. He rode away. Jiwon stood with the scroll and watched him go. 30% of all income. That was more than the farm earned after expenses. It meant giving everything away, working for the cauldron, or closing down. Rudolph stood nearby. His hands were shaking. He knew the Crimson Cauldron. He had worked for them for 20 years. He knew what they did to those who refused. April stood by the post, her hand on the sword. Her face was stony. Soyeon stood on the porch. She clutched the catalog scroll to her chest. Lena sat on the step and took notes. Date: Crimson Cauldron, 30%, 30 days. She raised her head and looked at Jiwon. She asked quietly, "What are we going to do?" Jiwon looked at her, at the field, at the 5 hills, at the stream, at the silvery grass, at the road down which the horseman had ridden away. He clenched the scroll in his hand. He said, "What we know how to do. Work. 30 days. Jiwon stood in the field and counted. Not money, not days. People. Rudolph at the cash register. April by the pole, with Jan in the attic with the scroll. Lena with a book. Theo with a sword. Oliver in Torheim with a report. The adventurers in line. Graham's wife with stones for the roof. The blacksmith's son. The miller's daughter. Everyone who had passed through his dungeons over these 2 months. Everyone who earned their first money. Everyone who learned to wield a sword. Everyone who slept peacefully for the first time. The Crimson Cauldron wants 30% of all of this. Jiwon clenched the scroll in his hand and threw it into the embers of the morning fire. The paper flared up and turned black. Soyeon saw it. She asked. "He's sure," Jiwon said. "Yes." Soyeon nodded. She went to make breakfast. Jiwon spent the first week fortifying, not the walls, not the fences, the dungeons. He went through all 5, checked every ash-lined contour, doubled the thickness, added a 3rd ring of a mixture of ash and crushed quartz that Theo had brought out of the cave dungeon. The quartz strengthened the barrier. Jiwon didn't know why, but he could feel it. The quartz's crystal lattice resonated with the mycelium and created a barrier against external roots, like an ultrasonic mole repeller. Different physics, same principle. He checked the mycelium. The silvery threads had grown thicker over the past month. Some were as thick as a finger. The network connected all 5 dungeons into a single system. The temple dungeon in the center was the hub, the most powerful one. Energy flowed from it to the other 4, a supply line, like the root system of an old oak tree that feeds the young saplings around it. Jiwon fell into thought. If the cauldron attacks physically, they'll come to the dungeons. They'll go inside. They'll try to destroy them from within. Or block the entrances. Or just kill those standing at the doors. He's no fighter. April is alone. Rudolph is crippled. Theo is a boy. Soyeon is a priestess without magic. Lena is a child. Direct combat means death. But Jiwon wasn't thinking about combat. He was thinking about the soil, about crop rotation, about fertilizing, about how a farmer protects his harvest, not with a sword, with cunning, with patience, with preparation. He gathered everyone in the evening around the campfire. Rudolph, April, Soyeon, Lena, Theo. He said, "The boiler will come. Not in 30 days. Sooner. They'll send scouts. Then pressure. then force. This isn't a war, it's a market takeover. He'd seen this in his past life, when a large agricultural holding company wanted to take land from a small farm. The methods are the same. Intimidate, isolate, strangle them economically, then come and take it. So-yeon asked what to do. Jiwon said, "Grow faster than they can crush you." In the second week, he planted the last seed, the 7th of 7. He spent a long time choosing the spot, not in the field, beyond it, on a hill 100 meters from the farm, from where you can see the whole valley. You can see the road to Torheim, you can see the forest, you can see the village. For whom? He closed his eyes and thought of everyone at once. Of Lee with the book, of Rudolph with the crutch, about April with her swords, about So-yeon with her scroll, about Theo with his blade, about Graham's wife with her roof tile,
About every adventurer who entered his dungeon and came out alive. The seed in his hand flared with heat. It almost burned his palm.
He planted it deep, 2 palms wide instead of 1. He watered it. He didn't circle it with ash. This dungeon didn't need boundaries. This dungeon was a sentinel. Jiwon didn't know what would grow, but he knew for whom. For everyone. 3 days later, people appeared on the road. 5 of them, in armor, with the Kotla crest. Not adventurers, mercenaries, heavy, armed. They approached the fence and formed a semicircle. The leader shouted that the farm must cease operations until Kotla's conditions were met. April stepped out to meet them, alone. She stood by the post, sword in its sheath. Her hands were free. The leader looked at her. He recognized her. His expression changed. He turned to his men. He said something quietly. One of the mercenaries turned pale. Another took a step back. April Hayes, rank B, former top student at Steel Wind Academy.
They knew her. The leader spat. He said they'd be back, with those against whom rank B wouldn't help. They turned around. They left. April stood by the pillar and watched them go. Then she turned to Jiwon. She said, "They'll bring a rank A, or several Bs. She doesn't stand a chance against a group." Jiwon said, "I know." She asked, "The plan?" Jiwon said, "I have one." He worked for the next 3 days without looking up. He entered every combat dungeon with Theo, not to fight, to inspect. Theo provided cover. Jiwon studied the walls, the floors, the ceilings, the corridors. He was looking for what he knew from greenhouses, weak points in the structure, places where air currents could be redirected, places where the humidity was higher and the stone softer, places where the mycelium came to the surface inside the dungeon. He found them. There were nodes in every dungeon, like nerve endings. If he pressed them in a certain way, the dungeon reacted. A wall shifted, the ceiling lowered. The floor tilted. The dungeon was a living organism, and like any organism, it reacted to its master's touch. Jiwon tested it. He placed his palm on a node. The dungeon obeyed. The wall moved, slowly by centimeters, but it moved. He could control the dungeon from the inside, not completely, not quickly, but he could. He told April. She listened. Then she said, "If enemies enter the dungeon and Jiwon can change the layout on the fly, then it's a trap.
The dungeon will become a trap for those who enter it. Jiwon. He wasn't a farmer building a fortress. He was a farmer who knew his field better than any invader. Every root, every stone, every crack. The enemy will enter the dungeon as if it were an ordinary dungeon, and they'll emerge into a dungeon that has been rebuilt around them. For the first time ever, April smiled. Not widely, just the corner of her mouth, but she smiled. On the 78th day, a carriage appeared on the road. Not a wagon, a carriage. Black.
With the coat of arms of the licensing chamber. 2 horses, a coachman in uniform. A woman stepped out of the carriage, tall, a severe dark suit, thin-framed glasses, hair pulled back into a bun, a thick folder of papers in her hands. She surveyed the farm with a single long glance, the dungeon, the fence, a line. Rudolph at the ticket window, Lena with a book, April by the post. She approached Jiwon, introduced herself. Annabelle Rain, Senior Inspector of the Licensing Chamber, Provincial Capital. She said she had come for 2 reasons. First, a routine inspection of a facility with more than 2 dungeons. Second, a complaint from the Crimson Cauldron Guild regarding unlicensed activity. Jiwon said he had licenses. He pulled out the papers. Annabelle took them. She read slowly, every line, every stamp, every signature. Then she closed the folder. She said, "Licenses for 3 dungeons. You have 5, plus a 6th on the way." Jiwon looked at the hill beyond the farm. The sentry dungeon had already risen half a meter. Annabelle followed his gaze.
6 dungeons, 3 licenses. That's a violation, Jiwon said. 3 grew after the paperwork was filed. He didn't have time, Annabelle said. Ignorance of the procedure does not exempt you from liability. The fine for each unlicensed dungeon is 50 silver. That comes to 1.5 gold. The farm didn't have 1.5 gold. The farm had 63 silver in savings. Less than half the fine. Jiwon didn't argue, didn't ask, didn't explain. He said, "Let's go. I'll show you." Annabelle raised an eyebrow. He led her across the field, slowly, just as he had led investors through the greenhouse in his past life. He showed her the first dungeon. He told her about Rudolph, about the stool by the cash register, about the cripple who had earned his first money in 2 years. He showed her the second one. He told her about Graham's wife and the roof. He showed her the third one.
He told her about Theo and the wooden sword that turned to steel. He showed her the 4th one. He didn't tell her anything. He just said, "This one has no monsters. It's for those who need to rest." Annabelle looked at him. She was silent. He showed her the temple one. He told her about the crossbreeding, about the catalog, about a new type not listed in the guild's registry. Annabelle listened. She took notes. Her handwriting was small and precise, just like Lena's. Jiwon noticed. Then he showed her the mycelium. He dug a shallow trench, silvery threads, as thick as a finger. Annabelle crouched down. She touched it. Her expression changed. For the first time during the entire visit, she asked. "It's natural," Jiwon said. "It's cultivated, like everything here." She stood up, brushed off her knees. She said, "Show me the documentation." Lena brought the books, 3 notebooks. Every day, every visitor, every coin, every crystal,
Every observation. Soil temperature, growth time, monster types.
Levels, loot, injuries, 0 deaths, 0 serious injuries in 2.5 months. Annabelle read the notebooks. An hour and a half, 2 hours. She didn't look up. When she did, her face was different. Not stern, not hostile, tired. She said, in 10 years of working at the chamber, she had inspected 247 dungeons. 112 people had died. 39 children had died. Her younger brother had died in an unlicensed dungeon when he was 16. She had come to the chamber to put a stop to it. In 10 years, she had shut down 53 dangerous dungeons. She had issued 312 fines. She revoked 81 licenses, and not a single dungeon became any safer because of it. Because dungeons don't obey paperwork. They grow as they please and kill as they please. She fell silent. Then she looked at Lena's notebooks, at the neat lines, at the entries. 0 deaths, she said, except for these. Jiwon was silent. Then he said, a fine. 1.5 gold coins. He'll pay. He needs time. Annabelle closed the folder. She said, there will be no fine. She would issue licenses for the remaining dungeons herself right now using her authority, and she would write a recommendation to the Chamber's central office regarding the creation of a new category, cultivated dungeon. Jiwon looked at her. She took blank forms out of the folder. She filled them out. She stamped them. Her hands didn't tremble. Her handwriting was steady. She paused. She looked up. She said, 1 condition. She would remain on the farm as a permanent inspector-observer, officially, with the right to report to the chamber. She wants to see how this works. Every day. She wants to write regulations, the first ever regulations for cultivated dungeons, so that what he does becomes the rule rather than the exception, so that any farmer in any principality can grow a dungeon to standard and not a single child dies. Jiwon looked at her. Then he held out his hand. She shook it, firmly. Soyeon stood on the porch and smiled. Lena took notes. April stood by the pillar, and for the first time in a long while, her hand wasn't resting on her sword. That evening, Annabelle sat at the table in Rudolph's house and wrote. Soyeon placed a cup of herbal tea in front of her. Annabelle didn't notice. She kept writing. Soyeon set down a bowl of soup. Annabelle didn't notice. She was writing. Lena approached and quietly pushed the cup closer. Annabelle looked up. She looked at the tea, at the soup, at Lena. She picked up the cup, took a sip, closed her eyes. She said quietly, it had been a long time since anyone had served her tea. Soyeon said, get used to it. The watchtower on the hill was built on the 90th day. It was unlike any of the previous ones. It was a tower, not very tall, 5 meters, made of gray stone overgrown with silvery grass, without a door, with a single round window at the top. Light streamed from the window, soft, greenish, like from a temple dange, but stronger. The light was visible from the road, from the village, from the edge of the forest. Jiwon approached the tower and placed his palm on the wall. Warm, a humming inside, strong, deep. The tower pulsed in rhythm with all the other dungeons at once.
It was connected to them all through the mycelium, a network node, a beacon. Jiwon walked around the tower 3 times. There was no entrance. He tried pressing on the wall at different points. Nothing. He tried calling out. Nothing. The tower stood silent and shone. So-yeon came and examined it. She said it wasn't a dungeon, it was a sentinel stone. The texts of the first gardener described something similar, observation points that the gardener placed at the edges of his field. They yielded no loot. They contained no monsters. They observed and warned. Jiwon asked, "What did they warn about?" So-yeon said, "About weeds, about foreign roots, about what comes to take the harvest."
On the 93rd day, the Crimson Cauldron arrived in earnest. Not 5 mercenaries, 20, and with them 3 B-rank adventurers and Garrett Mole himself, the master of the cauldron. Jiwon saw them from the hill. The column was coming down the road from Torheim, the glint of steel, red cloaks bearing a crest. At the front, on horseback, a man in black armor, old, gray-haired, with a face scarred by battle. Garrett Mole. 40 years in the dungeons, 3 lost squads, a man who sincerely believed that dungeons could not be tamed. Jiwon came down from the hill. He surveyed everyone. He said, "They're coming." Plan 2. First, don't fight outside. April can't hold out against 20. Second, lure them inside. The column approached the fence by noon. Garrett Mole dismounted. He looked at the farm, at the dungeon, at the tower on the hill. His expression didn't change. He'd seen hundreds of dungeons. These didn't impress him. He said loudly, "The Linden farm must be shut down." According to the Northern Region Charter, by the right of the Crimson Cauldron, all dungeons must be sealed, the owner fined, the workers removed. He didn't ask. He declared. Jiwon stood by the fence. April was nearby. Rudolph was nearby on a crutch. Lena was nearby with a book. So-yeon was on the porch. Annabelle was with a folder. Jiwon said, "No. Quiet. Calm down." Just as he had said in the greenhouse when they offered to buy the plot. Garrett looked at him for a long time. Then he gave his own nod. The 3 B-rank adventurers moved toward the first dungeon. Garrett said, "They'll go through every dungeon to the end. They'll wipe them out completely. They'll prove that these dungeons are just as dangerous as any others, that there are no safe dungeons, that Jiwon is deceiving people with a fairy tale." Jiwon didn't stop them. He said, "Please, go in." The 3 adventurers entered the first dungeon. The door closed. Jiwon turned to April. He said one word. "Go." She nodded. She walked to the second dungeon. She entered. Jiwon approached the wall of the first dungeon. He placed his palm on the knot. He closed his eyes. Inside, the dungeon began to change, slowly. The corridor of the first room lengthened by 2 meters. The walls shifted by a hand's width. The ceiling dropped 5 centimeters. Rats and goblins hid in the cracks. Jiwon felt the dungeon as if it were his own body. Every stone, every turn, every shadow. The adventurers walked down the corridor and didn't notice the changes. They were used to dungeons. Dungeons are always different. But this one wasn't changing by accident.
It was changing for them. The second corridor turned right instead of left. The third room became a dead end. The floor sloped. One adventurer slipped. He got up. He cursed. He walked on. The fourth room, one that hadn't been there before, small, round, empty. 4 exits, all leading back to the entrance. The adventurers circled. 10 minutes, 20, half an hour.
They didn't understand. Danj was leading them in circles. He didn't kill them. He didn't hurt them. He led them, like a shepherd leads cows, gently, persistently, back to the door. An hour later they came out, all 3 of them, unscathed, not a single scratch, angry, confused. The oldest one said to Garrett, "Danj won't let us through. He's shifting, like he's alive." Garrett looked at Jiwon. Jiwon was standing by the wall with his palm on the stone. He took his hand away, rubbed his palm, turned around, said, "My dangers don't kill. They don't let in those I don't want to let in, and they let in those I do. This isn't a trap. It's a gate." Garrett was silent. His scars turned white. He said, "That's impossible. A dungeon doesn't obey a human." Jiwon said, "It obeys the one who raised it." Garrett stood and looked at him, then at the dungeon, then at his men. 20 mercenaries stood behind him. 3 B-rank adventurers stood at the entrance, unsure what to do. Garrett could have ordered an attack from the outside. Destroy the hills, tear up the ground, physically destroy the dungeon. He could have. Jiwon knew he could. But Garrett didn't move. He looked at the first dungeon, at the door, at the small wooden door with an iron ring. Then he said quietly, "I'll go alone, by myself, into the strongest one. Show me." Jiwon looked at him, then nodded, led him to the temple dungeon. He opened the door. Garrett went in, alone, unarmed. He left his sword at the entrance. The door closed. Jiwon didn't touch the walls, didn't change the corridors, didn't control it. He let the dungeon be what it was, a temple. Garrett came out 4 hours later. His face was wet, not from water, from tears. He was carrying a scroll in his hands, not the one Theo had found earlier, a different one. The dungeon had given him another scroll. Jiwon didn't know what was in it. Garrett didn't show him. He stood at the entrance and looked at the scroll, then at then at his men. Then he said, "Let's go." The senior mercenary asked, "What about the farm?" Garrett said, "The farm stays." He turned around, mounted his horse, rode off. The column followed him. 20 mercenaries, 3 adventurers, red cloaks, the glint of steel, the road, dust. That evening, Jiwon entered the temple dungeon, alone. He made his way through 7 levels, slowly. The monsters didn't touch him. The water lizards parted. The stone golems retreated to the walls. The shadow under the bridge dove deeper. The dungeon knew its master. On the 7th level in the temple hall, there was a plaque on the altar. It hadn't been there before. Jiwon approached. He read it. The letters weren't in the language of Gerholm. They were in Korean. 4 words.
The second farmer arrived. Jiwon stood in front of the plaque and looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down on the floor. Then he lay down. The ceiling was high. Green stones glowed like stars. He lay there and thought.
The first gardener knew that someone would come.
Left a catalog, left the seeds, left the mycelium that had been waiting for 1,500 years, waiting for the second farmer, for him. Jiwon closed his eyes. There were no more seeds in his pocket. All 7 had been planted, all 7 had grown. But he sensed it, deep in the earth, far beneath the mycelium, beneath the roots of the donja, beneath the soil of Gerholm. Something else, something enormous, something that had slept for 1,500 years and was now stirring. The first field, planted by the first gardener, somewhere down there, it was waking up. 3 weeks had passed since the cauldron's departure. Linden Farm had changed, not physically, from the inside. People had stopped being afraid. Rudolph no longer glanced back at the road every 5 minutes. Lena had stopped counting the number of armed men on the horizon. So-Yun had stopped hiding the scroll at night.
April had slept without nightmares for 3 nights in a row. Jiwon knew because the barn wall was thin.
He had stopped hearing her shudder. On the 100th day, Mira Orwald came to the farm, Lena's older sister, red-haired, tall, with cold eyes and a sharp tongue. She stood by the fence with a single sack on her back and looked at the farm the way one looks at something they don't believe in. Lena saw her from the window, dropped her book. She ran. She hugged her. Mira stood straight and didn't hug her back. Then her arms trembled. Then she hugged her, tightly, silently. Rudolph got up from the stool. He stood and watched. Mira looked at him, at the crutch, at the tin box with coins, at the sign by the entrance, Linden's Dungeon Farm. She said, "What's going on here?" Rudolph said, "Work." Mira spent 2 days on the farm before she spoke to Jiwon. She walked, looked, listened, counted. Jiwon saw her counting, with her eyes, every visitor, every coin, every crystal.
On the 3rd day, she approached him in the morning. She said, "He earns 60 silver coins a month, spends 32, 28 net. That's not much."
Jiwon asked, "Not enough for what?" She said, "Not enough for what he's building. 5 dungeons, soon to be 6, a line of adventurers, a unique temple dungeon with loot you can't find anywhere else, and 28 silver left over. Any tavern in Torheim makes that much. The problem isn't the dungeons, the problem is the prices. 3 copper coins for entry into rank F is 40% cheaper than the market rate. For the temple dungeon, he charges 10 copper coins. He should be charging 50, at least." She'd worked as a bartender in the city for a year. She knows that people pay for value, and the value here is enormous. Jiwon listened. She was right. He thought about soil and seeds, not about money, not about the market, not about pricing. He's a farmer, not a merchant. Mira said, "She needs a position. Commercial manager."
She'll negotiate with the guilds, set prices, sign contracts. He'll grow, she'll sell.
Jiwon looked at her, asked why she came back. Mira fell silent. Then she said, because her sister had stopped writing letters of complaint and started writing reports, because her father had stopped drinking, because she'd hated herself for 3 years for leaving. And now she wants to be here, not out of pity, out of calculation. Jiwon nodded. He said, "Porridge is on the stove. We'll find a bed." Mira snorted. She said, "Porridge isn't a salary." Jiwon said, "You'll get a salary when you bring in revenue." Mira smiled, for the first time, subtly, like someone who'd finally met someone who wasn't taken in by her barbs. Mira turned the finances around in 2 weeks. She raised prices. She introduced membership plans for regular adventurers. She struck a deal with a merchant from Torheim to buy up unique loot from the temple dungeon at a fixed price. She set up a contract with a blacksmith to repair weapons at the entrance. 10% of the repair fee went to the farmer. Revenue rose to 110 silver coins a month. Rudolph looked at the numbers and shook his head. Lena kept 2 ledgers, one for dungeons, the other for finances. Mira checked both every evening. The sisters sat at the table and cross-checked the numbers. Jiwon watched them from behind the door. A redhead and a brunette, leaning over their notebooks. He turned away. He went out into the field. On the 115th day, a girl arrived at the farm, quiet, in a simple dress, alone, without guards. She called herself Heirin, no last name. She said she'd heard about the farm from a passing cartographer. She said she wanted to work, at anything, weeding, cleaning, whatever they asked. Jiwon looked at her hands, soft, no calluses, not a peasant, not a city girl. He looked at her posture, straight, at her manner of speaking, quiet but precise, every word chosen. He didn't ask who she was. He gave her a bucket and a shovel. He said, "The ash lines need to be refreshed every week. Start with the first dungeon." Heirin took the bucket. She took the shovel. She went. She didn't complain. She didn't ask why. She worked all day. By evening, the ash lines around the first and second dungeons had been refreshed perfectly, smoother than when Jiwon had done it. He looked at the lines. He looked at Heirin. She stood with the shovel and waited. He said, "Good. Tomorrow, the 3rd and 4th. She nodded. So-yeon brought her a cup of tea. Heirin took it with both hands. She drank in small sips. Her eyes were closed. She was smiling, quietly, barely noticeably, like someone who, for the first time in her life, was tired from work rather than from waiting. A week later, Jiwon realized it. Heirin noticed things others didn't. She saw that the line of ash on the 3rd dungeon was thinner on the north side. She saw that the mycelium on the surface between the 4th and 5th dungeons was slightly darker than usual. She saw that the moss on the wall of the temple dungeon was growing faster on the left than on the right. She didn't speak of it aloud. She would approach Jiwon and point it out, quietly, precisely. He checked every time. Every time, she was right. On the 10th day, he asked, "Where from?" She said, she'd been observing her whole life. There's nothing else to do in the palace if you're the 3rd princess without a magical gift. Jiwon wasn't surprised. He'd expected it. Her posture, her hands, her manner of speaking. He nodded. He said, "Here, you're not a princess. Here, you're a cartographer." Heirin raised her head. She looked at him. Her eyes were huge, wet. She said, "Okay." Jiwon said, Tomorrow Oliver will bring the instruments for depth measurement. You'll learn. Winter arrived on the 130th day.
The first snow fell on the Linden field in a thin white layer. The dungeons stood like hills under a white blanket. Only the tower on the hill glowed with a green light through the blizzard. Jiwon stood by the window of Rudolph's house and watched. 7 dungeons, 7 doors, 7 stories. Each one grew from a specific person, each one for someone. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass. Outside the window, the field was white and silent. The mycelium beneath the snow hummed more quietly than usual, as if it, too, had fallen asleep. But not completely. Jiwon could feel it even through the walls of the house, a pulse, steady, slow, alive. He ran his hand across the glass. Moisture remained on his finger. Condensation. A warm house, a cold world. Glass between them. 4 months between him and this world. 130 days. A handful of seeds and a field of black earth. He looked at his hands. Calluses. Cracks on his knuckles. Dirt under his fingernails that never washed off. The hands of a farmer. Not a hero, not a mage, not a warrior. A farmer who plants and waits. Plants and waits. A floorboard creaked behind him. So-yeon entered the room with 2 mugs. She set one next to him on the windowsill. Forest herb tea. Hot. It smelled of mint and something bitter. Jiwon took the mug. So-yeon stood beside him and looked out the window too. She asked quietly, "What was he thinking about?" Jiwon said, "About spring." So-yeon smiled. She said there were still 3 months until spring. Jiwon nodded. He said, "A farmer always thinks about the next season." So-yeon stood beside him, barefoot on the cold floor. He looked at her feet. He said, "Put on some socks." She said that the earth speaks through the soles of your feet. He said, "This is a wooden floor, not the earth." She laughed, quietly. She left. Jiwon took a sip of tea. Hot, bitter, good. A delegation arrived in the morning. 10 men. The Imperial Adventurers Guild. Gloomy men in furs and steel, gray-haired, heavy, accustomed to war and blood. They rode on horseback. The horses snorted from the cold, steam from their nostrils. Their hooves sank into the snow up to their hocks. An old man rode in front, huge, with a white beard and a scar across his forehead. General Seeker Baldwin Frost, a legend of the North, a man who had cleared 3 S-rank dungeons with his own hands, a man even monsters feared. He dismounted at the fence. With difficulty, his left knee creaked. An old wound. Every veteran has a knee that creaks. He stood there, looking at the farm, at the snow, at the dungeons, at the tower, at the line of adventurers at the entrance to the temple dungeon. 7 people standing in the snow, shuffling from foot to foot, waiting for it to open, like in line for bread, only instead of bread, a dungeon. Baldwin looked at Rudolph at the ticket counter in his warm sheepskin coat. Rudolph was sitting on a stool. An iron crutch leaned against the wall. A tin coin box on an upside-down bucket. Lena stood nearby with a notebook in her mittens. A pencil stuck out from behind her ear.
She was writing down the name of everyone who approached the ticket window. Baldwin looked at April by the post in her winter coat. She stood motionless, swords under her coat, eyes on the road. A sentry. Baldwin recognized her as a fighter at first glance, by the way she distributed her weight, by the way she held her hands, by the way she breathed. Even, calm, ready. He looked at So-yeon, who was carrying out a tray of cups for the line. Hot tea. Free. The adventurers took the cups and nodded. They were used to it. At Miru, who was counting yesterday's takings while standing by the window with a notebook. At Hae-ring, who was standing by the second dungeon with Oliver's tools and taking measurements. She was pressing a long copper probe against the hillside and wrote down the readings on a small board.
Her hands were red from the cold.
But she didn't stop. At Annabelle, who was sitting on the porch in a wool coat and writing the regulations, a stack of papers on her lap, an inkwell on the railing, a quill in her hand. She didn't look up when the delegation pulled up. She finished the sentence, put a period, looked up, adjusted her glasses, looked, stood up. Jiwon came out to meet them, silently. He didn't say a word, didn't introduce himself, didn't bow, didn't explain. He simply led the way, just as he had led Annabelle, just as he had led the investors through the greenhouse in Jeju. Slowly, step by step. The snow crunched under their feet. Baldwin walked beside him. His men followed behind. 6 men in fur coats. They were silent. They watched. Jiwon led them to the first dange, a small hill, a wooden door with an iron ring, snow on the roof. By the door stood a bench that Theo had knocked together a month ago.
A couple of adventurers sat on the bench, bandaging each other's minor scrapes. Bandages from So-yeon's supplies.
Jiwon said, "First, goblins and rats, rank F, for Rudolph." Baldwin looked at him. Jiwon didn't explain. He walked on. "Second, a cave in rocks, a stone door, low, wide, cold air and the smell of wet stone seeped through the cracks. A wheelbarrow with gray stones stood nearby. The miller's daughter was stacking them neatly. Stone from the dungeon. Building stone. Solid. 3 houses in Linden had already had their roofs repaired with this stone. Jiwon said, "For Graham's wife." Baldwin didn't ask who Graham's wife was. He walked on. The third, the forest and the wolves. A stump of dark wood, an arch of branches, the scent of pine needles and damp leaves wafted from behind the door. Theo stood at the entrance, with a real sword, with a scar on his forearm that he wore like a medal. Next to him was a yul from a neighboring village. Theo was explaining to him how to hold a shield,
Showing him, correcting his grip. The boy listened with his mouth agape.
Jiwon said to Theo. Baldwin looked at the teenager with the sword, at the boy with the shield. Something flashed in his eyes. Recognition. He, too, had once been a boy with a wooden sword. The fourth. Silence and water. A round hill covered in moss. A light door without a lock. Warmth wafted from behind it. The scent of a hot spring. No weapons. No monsters. Rest, Jiwon said. For April. Baldwin looked at the door, then at April, who was standing by a post 30 paces away. She wasn't looking at them. She was looking at the road. But her shoulders were relaxed, just a little, half a centimeter lower than usual. Baldwin noticed. He knew what shoulders looked like when they had stopped waiting for a blow. The fifth. A temple of water and stone. Stone walls entwined with vines, an arch adorned with the patterns of the first gardener, a line at the entrance. 7 people. Waiting. Drinking tea from So-yun cups.
Discussing strategy. Who will go first? Who would provide cover? Who would carry the potions? The usual conversation of adventurers, only without fear. Without that crack in the voice that Baldwin had heard for 40 years at every entrance to every dungeon. Here, they weren't afraid. Here, they discussed. Like a job. Like a craft. Jiwon said, "For everyone who seeks." Baldwin looked at the line, at the faces, young, focused, alive. The 6th. A watchtower on the hill. 5 meters of gray stone covered in silvery grass, a round window at the top, a green light, a beacon, visible from everywhere, from the road, from the village, from the edge of the forest. The tower hummed. Baldwin placed his palm on the wall. He pulled it away. He looked at his hand, then at Jiwon. Jiwon said, "For everyone who remains." And the 7th. Jiwon led them to the far end of the field, a path through the snow, only his footprints. He walked here every morning, alone. The 7th dungeon was small, Inconspicuous. A mound barely higher than a snowdrift. No door. Instead of a door, an opening in the stone. Low. You had to bend down to enter. A bench stood in front of the entrance, wooden, simple. A thin layer of snow lay on it. A dungeon that wasn't in the plan, that grew on its own. 3 weeks ago, from the mycelium, from the connections between the other 6. Jiwon didn't plant it, didn't choose the spot, didn't think about who it was for. The field planted it itself, like a tree that drops a seed, like a garden that perpetuates itself. Jiwon found it at dawn. He went out on his rounds and saw a mound that hadn't been there yesterday. He crouched down next to it, placed his palm on it. Warm, pulsing, alive. He went inside. 1 room, small, warm, a table, 4 chairs, a teapot on a stone stand, a cupboard in the wall, empty. Jiwon stood in that room and understood. Danj was asking him, not with words, through its form. The empty table was asking, "Sit down." The empty chairs were asking, "Call out." The empty cupboard was asking, "Fill it. Make this a place." He put the bruise remedies that So-yun had prepared from forest herbs into the cupboard. 3 jars, ointment for bruises, a tincture for muscle pain, a powder for fever. He poured tea into a thermos. He placed a note on the table. He wrote it by hand, crookedly. He still couldn't write the local script very well. Lena taught him in the evenings. Adventurers usually rest here before heading back. Tea in the thermos, bruise medicine in the cupboard. If you're tired, get some sleep. No one's rushing you. Signed, H.D. 2 letters. Han Jiwon, farmer. General Baldwin stood in front of the 7th dungeon and looked at the bench, at the opening in the stone, at the thin snow on the roof of the mound. His men stood behind him,
10 men in furs, silent. Baldwin looked at Jiwon. Jiwon nodded. Baldwin bent down. He went inside, alone. His men waited outside. Silence. Snow was falling. Light, frequent. There was no wind. Jiwon stood and waited, hands in his pockets, a straw hat pulled back on his head. Snowflakes settled on the brim of his hat and didn't melt. Baldwin's men stood and said nothing. One of them, a young man, about 30, a scar on his chin, he asked quietly, "What's inside?" Jiwon said, "A table, chairs, tea." The warrior didn't understand. He asked again, "Monsters? Traps?" Jiwon shook his head. "A table, chairs, tea?" The warrior fell silent. Baldwin came out 20 minutes later, an empty cup in his hands. His eyes were red, wet eyelashes. His white beard trembled slightly. He held the cup with both hands, just like Rudolph holds his mug, with 2 large palms, gently, as if it were something fragile. He set the cup down on the bench, carefully, next to the snow. Then he looked at his hands that had defeated 3 S-rank dungeons, hands that had killed so many monsters he stopped counting in the 2nd decade, hands that had buried friends, many friends. He slowly sank into the snow, right onto the ground, sat down. His knee creaked. He didn't pay it any mind. His men flinched. A step forward, he raised his hand, stopped them, sat in the snow and looked at the farm, at the 7 dungeons, at the people at the entrances, at the smoke from the house's chimney, at the light of the tower on the hill, at the line at the temple dungeon, at Theo teaching the boy, at So-yeon with a tray, at Lena with a book, at Rudolph on the stool, at April by the post, at Mira in the window, at Heirin with her probe and notepad, at Annabelle with her pen and papers, at all these people, at this snow, at this field. Then he spoke, quietly, so that only those standing nearby could hear. "This isn't a farm. It's a village of the future. We've been fighting the dungeons our whole lives, and he tamed them for the people," and took off his hat, a fur one, a warm one. He took it off and held it in his hand. Snow fell on his gray head. His men stood in silence.
One by one, they took off their hats. 10 gray-haired warriors stood in the snow with their heads uncovered, looking at the farmer in a straw hat who stood next to his field. A young warrior with the scar on his chin was the last to take off his hat. His hands were shaking, not from the cold. Jiwon stood and said nothing. He didn't know what to say. He never knew what to say at moments like this. In his past life, when his vertical farm had finally started operating and investors came to see it, and one of them said that this was the future of agriculture, Jiwon had remained silent then too. Then he offered tea. Here he did the same. He bent down. He picked up Baldwin's cup from the bench, brushed a snowflake off the rim, said, "Let's go inside." So-yeon made too much soup. Baldwin looked up at him from the snow, wet eyes,
a white beard, a scar across his forehead. Then he struggled to his feet. His knee creaked again. He brushed the snow off his fur pants, put on his hat, nodded.
He walked toward the house. His men followed him, one after another, along the path in the snow, toward the house with smoke coming from the chimney, toward the warmth, toward the soup. That evening, Rudolph's house was full. Everyone was seated at the table. Rudolph, Lena, Mira, April, Soyeon, Annabelle, Heirin, Theo, Baldwin and his men. 20 people in a room meant for 10. Crowded, hot, noisy. Soyeon served the soup, bowl after bowl. She'd been cooking since morning, 3 pots, because she knew. She always knew how many mouths would be at the table, as if she could sense it. Soup made with wild mushrooms and wild onions, with herbs that smelled so good they made your mouth water the moment you walked in. Mira poured tea. She was in charge. Who sits, who stands, who moves over. Her red hair flew up with every turn of her head. She was in her element. The chaos of people and numbers. Lena was writing down the guests' names, every single one. Rank, specialization, where they came from, how long they'd been serving. She asked quietly and politely. The warriors answered in surprise. No one had ever written their names in a notebook before. Annabelle discussed training dungeon standards with Baldwin. She opened her manual. 53 pages. Tiny handwriting, diagrams, tables. Baldwin read and nodded. His eyebrows rose higher and higher. He said that in 40 years of service, he had never seen a document that was so necessary and yet so lacking. Annabelle adjusted her glasses. She said it would be. Now it would be. Heirin was showing Oliver, who had arrived with the delegation, her measurements of the mushroom bed. 12 small boards with numbers, graphs drawn in charcoal. Oliver took off his glasses, wiped them, put them back on, took them off, wiped them, put them on again. He said it was the best dungeon mapping he'd ever seen, that her measurement system was more accurate than his own. Heirin blushed. She lowered her head. Then she raised it. She said she wanted to keep learning. Oliver said he would teach her. For free. For the honor. Theo was telling the youngest of the warriors about the forest dungeon and the ogre he'd bypassed at the edge of the clearing. He was waving his arms, showing how he'd dodged, how he'd run, how he'd grabbed a chest with one hand and pushed off the wall with the other. The warrior listened with a half-smile. He had killed dragons. But he listened to the boy with his stories, because there was something in Theo's voice that the warrior himself hadn't felt in a long time. Joy. Pure, undiluted joy from adventure. April sat in the corner, quietly, but not alone. One of Baldwin's warriors sat next to her, an old man with an empty left sleeve. He'd lost his arm in an A-rank dungeon 12 years ago. They didn't speak. They just sat side by side. 2 people who know what a dungeon is like from the inside. They know the smell of blood mixed with the smell of wet stone. They know the silence after battle, which is louder than any scream. They know what it's like to wake up in the night and not know if you're alive or not. They didn't speak, but between them was a silence that spoke louder than words. The old warrior took a sip of tea. April took a sip of hers, at the same time, without coordinating. Rudolph sat at the head of the table, in his place, in his house. His iron crutch stood against the wall, not needed.
He is sitting. He is home. He is the master. He held the teacup with both hands and looked at all these people at his table. General Baldwin Frost, a legend of the North, sitting at his table, eating soup made by his landlady, drinking tea from his mug, in his house, in the house of the cripple from Linden village. His eyes were alive, not dead like 4 months ago. Alive, wet, but alive. Jiwon sat on the porch, outside, alone. He didn't go to the table, not because he didn't want to, because he was used to it.
In the greenhouse in Jeju, he'd also go outside when everyone gathered in the shed. He would sit on a crate and look at the garden beds. Not because he didn't like people, because he needed to be with what he had grown, to hear the silence between the rows, to smell the earth without voices. It was the same here. He sat on the porch and listened. Snow fell on his straw hat, quietly, softly, each snowflake like a tiny touch. 7 Dange stood in the field beyond the fence, quiet, sleeping, covered in snow. The mycelium underground hummed evenly and calmly. All 7 dungeons are connected. All 7 are alive. The tower on the hill shone through the blizzard, green fire, a beacon, visible for miles. Far below, deep, beneath the roots, beneath the mycelium, beneath the soil, the first field stirred in its sleep. Jiwon could feel it, not with his ears, not with his hands, with something else. The way a farmer senses rain approaching, the way a gardener senses a tree is sick, the way an agronomist senses the soil is ready. The first field was far below, vast, ancient. For 1,500 years it had lain unattended, without an owner, without a second farmer. Its dungeons had run wild. They had spread out, become wild overgrowth, become traps, become death. Because a garden without a gardener is not a garden. It is a jungle. Jiwon sat and thought. For the first time in 1,500 years, someone was tending the land above him. For the first time, someone was planting not for themselves, not for profit, not for power, for people. He took a handful of soil from his pocket that he had scooped up that morning at the foot of the tower. He rubbed it between his fingers. Warm, alive, even in winter, even under the snow, even on the coldest day, the earth was alive. He clenched it in his fist. Dark crumbs fell through his fingers. They fell onto the porch, on the white snow, black on white, seed and field, beginning and end. No, not the end. Beginning and continuation. The door behind him opened. Warmth, light, the smell of soup and people. Lena stepped out onto the porch, wearing mittens, holding a book. She always had a book with her, just as April always had swords, just as So-yeon was always barefoot, just as Rudolph was always on a stool. Everyone carries with them what makes them who they are. Lena sat down next to him, close. Her shoulder brushed against his elbow. She opened the book to the last page, a pencil in her mitten. Awkward, but she was used to it. She wrote it down, neatly, evenly. Her handwriting had improved over the past 4 months. Day 130. The first snow. The Imperial Guild delegation. General Baldwin took off his hat.
So-yeon's soup. 3 pots. Everyone at the table. She looked up. She looked at Jiwon. Gray eyes. Serious. Not childishly serious. 4 months ago she had cried in the field when he said he was a farmer. Now she wasn't crying. Now she was writing. She asked,
"What next?"
Jiwon looked at the field, at the snow, at the tower, at the light in the house's windows, at the 7 hills under a white blanket. He thought, what next? In the spring, the 2nd farm will open. So-yeon will transcribe the catalog. Hae-rin will become a cartographer. Mira will sign contracts with the 3 principalities. Annabelle will approve the regulations. April will train the first group of instructors. Theo will receive a D rank. Rudolph will sit on a stool and count coins. And somewhere far away, deep inside, the answer would come to the question he hadn't yet asked aloud. Who planted the first seed? And why? And what he left behind besides the catalog? But that was for later. Right now, there was snow. Right now, it was warm outside the door. Right now, there was soup. Right now, the family is at the table, a group that 4 months ago was a handful of strangers and has now become something for which he has no word.
He said, "We'll plant some more in the spring."
Lena nodded. She wrote it down. Spring. New seeds. She closed the book, pressed it to her chest. They sat on the porch and watched the snow. Inside the house, people were laughing. Someone dropped a mug. So-yeon gasped. Mira said something sharp. Rudolph roared with laughter, deep, low, the kind of laugh he used to have 20 years ago when he was an adventurer and life lay ahead of him. April snorted quietly, barely audible, but she snorted. Hae-rin laughed, for the first time in front of everyone, ringing like a bell, like a stream over rocks. Annabelle adjusted her glasses and smiled, with just one corner of her mouth, but she smiled. Theo began to tell a new story, about the fence, about the bridge, about the shadow under the water. Baldwin listened and nodded. His men listened and remained silent. The soup grew cold in the bowls. No one was in a hurry. Snow fell on the Linden farm, on the 7 dungeons.
On the silvery grass beneath the white blanket, on the mycelium humming deep below, on the tower shining like a lighthouse, on the house full of people, on the porch where the farmer and the girl with the book sat. The field slept until spring, but the roots did not sleep. The roots grew, quietly, deeply, in all directions. Silvery threads spread out beneath the earth, toward the village, toward the forest, toward the road, toward Torheim. Further, wider, deeper. A network, a living network. A garden that grew on its own. And somewhere very far away, deep within the earth, beneath layers of stone and clay and rock, the first field turned in its sleep. It sensed it. For the first time in 1,500 years, its soil was loved again. And it did something it had never done before. It released a new seed. Small, warm, pulsing, like a heart.
It rose through layers of soil and stone and clay, slowly, centimeter by centimeter, toward the surface, toward Jiwon's field, toward spring.
Toward a new season, toward a new beginning.
The seed rose, and the field waited, and the farmer sat on the porch in a straw hat looking at the snow. And he didn't know yet that in the spring a sprout would rise from the earth at his feet, one that wasn't in any catalog, not in the old ones, not in the new ones, a sprout that would change everything. But that's another story, and this one ends here, on the porch, in the snow, with a book and a handful of warm earth in his fist.